Good morning and welcome to the 28th meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2024. Before we begin, can I ask members to please ensure that all electronic devices are switched to silent. Our first item on the agenda is to decide whether to consider a draft report on our follow-up inquiry into salmon farming in Scotland in private and at future meetings. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Our next item of business is our final evidence session as part of our follow-up inquiry into salmon farming in Scotland. And this morning I welcome to the meeting Marie Goujon, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands. And with our officials from the Marine Directorate, we've got Charles Allen, the Senior Delivery Lead, Aquaculture, Fish Health and Biosecurity. Jill Barber, the Senior Delivery Lead from Agriculture Programme. And Hazel Bartels, the Senior Delivery Lead from the Aquaculture Programme. I also welcome Edward Mountain, who will be taking part in the discussion. And so before we begin, can I invite you to declare any relevant interests?
Thank you very much, Convener. I remind the committee members and those watching that in my register of interest, I declare that I have a part of a partnership in a wild salmon fishery on the River Spey. I've been involved in salmon management for over 40 years, and I'll probably just leave it at that, Convener.
Thank you. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the committee members. And I really just want to thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to discuss the follow-up inquiry into salmon farming in Scotland. The salmon farming industry is, of course, a hugely successful sector in Scotland, and we support it, recognising the benefits that the sector delivers today and can in the future. Now, we know that the sector can only be a truly sustainable success story if that economic growth goes hand in hand with positive outcomes for Scotland's communities and Scotland's natural environment. And I'm therefore very pleased to discuss the progress that's been made to address the challenges and the opportunities that were identified in the Salmon Farming in Scotland report today. Aquaculture is an important component of Scotland's blue economy, with farmed salmon being the UK's leading food export. Our vision for sustainable aquaculture, which was published last year, sets out the government's ambitions for the sustainable development of the sector, operating within environmental limits, and which recognises the considerable social and economic benefits that the sector delivers. I am pleased with the significant progress that we've made on our aquaculture commitments since the response to the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee report in 2019, despite the emergency response demands that had resulted from, of course, the management of COVID and EU exit. Now, we have a broad agenda on which we are generating momentum, and we're prioritising action across key areas such as protection of the environment and biodiversity, consenting, community benefit, business and animal health and welfare. And if it's helpful, I'd just quite like to outline, first of all, a few examples which I think demonstrate the breadth of the work that's been undertaken in that time. Firstly, in 2022, salmon farming production generated £324 million of gross value added, which is 7% of the Scottish marine economy, and it supports around 12,000 highly skilled and well-paid jobs across farming operations and supply chain businesses. And the Scottish Government and its partners continue to work together to ensure that communities see the direct benefit of aquaculture. As you heard from Crown Estate Scotland, from 2017 to 2022, aquaculture generated in the region of £50 million in rents, with the net revenues from marine assets out to 12 nautical miles distributed to coastal local authorities for the purpose of community benefit. Following the independent review of aquaculture regulation, we established the Scottish Aquaculture Council and the Consenting Task Group to coordinate work towards a sustainable future for the sector. The Consenting Task Group has delivered a new pre-application consenting framework which coordinates regulatory activity early in the development process, and it's currently being piloted in the Shetland and Highland local authority areas. Now, this work seeks to minimise delays by streamlining and removing unnecessary duplication without compromising environmental safeguards, while also ensuring that there are effective and transparent mechanisms for community engagement. As laid out in the programme for government, we will continue to work collaboratively to improve the fish farm consenting processes. A consultation is currently live on proposals to extend Scotland's marine planning zones, which would enable development beyond 3 nautical miles, and we remain committed to progress on spatial spatial planning, including through implementation of MPF4 and development of regional and national marine plans. And significant progress has already been made to support the protection of the environment, and that includes work on over 50 actions described in our wild salmon strategy and implementation plan. And in February this year, SEPA commenced the implementation of a new sea lice risk assessment framework for wild salmon, and a new framework for protecting sea trout populations will start in March next year. And the introduction of this framework marks a really crucial milestone, and I think highlights the progress that has been made since the recommendations of the previous parliamentary inquiries. There's also a new strengthened environmental regime which continues to be rolled out by SEPA to ensure the protection of the marine environment, and the transfer of all farms onto the framework is due to be completed by the end of this year. And following a public consultation, we will introduce a new environmental quality standard for imamectin benzoate in June 2028 to ensure that the use of this medicine stays within the UK Technical Advisory Group recommended limits to protect the environment. As outlined in the evidence to committee, the sector is investing heavily to address fish health challenges, which of course are complex and changeable. We've made progress to introduce mortality reporting, sea lice reporting, and we've lowered the sea lice intervention levels for farmed fish following Session 5's recommendations. And the Farmed Fish Health Framework continues to facilitate strategic approaches to support fish health and brings together a variety of different Scottish Government officials, fish health inspectors, the sector, regulators and our innovation partners. There's also been progress in relation to science and innovation, and we continue to invest in developing our science and evidence base. On top of that, I asked the Scottish Science Advisory Council to consider the use and communication of science and aquaculture consenting in response to issues which had been raised in the independent review which published its recommendations in 2022. And the committee, I know, are aware that we published a new marine science and innovation strategy in January of this year, and we also have a new Chief Scientific Advisor for Marine who has been appointed, which I think paves the way for further progress in relation to science and innovation. So with all of that, I do recognise that, of course, as ever, there's always more work to do, but I hope that the committee would acknowledge and welcome the significant progress that has been made. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Just before we move on to the questions, as we're already aware, Charles Allen is with us this morning, and I know, Charles, you've appeared before this committee on this topic back in June in your capacity as the head of the Fish Health Inspectorate. Would you mind briefly informing the committee and just clarifying your role in relation to today's proceedings?
Okay, I have a dual role currently in science, evidence, data and digital. I'm the Senior Delivery Lead for Aquaculture, Fish Health and Biosecurity. So my overall responsibility is for the running of the Fish Health Inspectorate, the diagnostic laboratories, the National Reference Laboratory and the aquarium facilities in Aberdeen, and with regard to biosecurity, import and export controls and similar. But I remain the head of the Fish Health Inspectorate. So I have a senior management role and a management role currently.
Thank you very much. We've got approximately, well, we've got up to about 11:30 for questions, so plenty of time. I'll kick off. And our first theme is looking at the economic and social benefit of aquaculture. So can I ask you how the Scottish Government is ensuring that community benefits and employment from salmon farms is maximised?
Well, I hope I was able to illustrate in my opening comments just how important the salmon industry is to our economy. I think when I mentioned the GVA figures there of over 300 million, the jobs that it provides throughout the supply chain, around 12,000 jobs. I don't think there's a constituency across Scotland that doesn't have some element of either an aquaculture business or its wider supply chain within it. So I think the extent of that is very broad in terms of its impact. I think the industry also, of course, provides well-paid jobs in some of the most rural parts of Scotland, and particularly in our island communities as well. And I know that some of those points came through quite strongly when you heard from the industry themselves as to the impact that they see locally in relation to that too. So I think it provides a huge amount of value, as I mentioned, through those jobs, through the wider supply chain, and of course is of great economic value and provides a lot of community benefit for rural and island communities across Scotland.
Thank you. In previous evidence, we heard from SEPA and they produced a fin-fish agriculture sector plan. And some of the objectives included, and I'll just read this one out, for communities to be confident that the environment is protected by being well informed and engaged with businesses operating on their land and water, and communities have a high level of trust towards regulators and businesses and benefit from open and transparent dialogue. Up to now, in discussion with stakeholders and communities, that doesn't seem to be the case. When do you expect SEPA to deliver some of these outcomes, given how important it is that communities are fully engaged with industry?
You're absolutely right. I think we also recognise that within our vision for sustainable aquaculture that we published in July last year, and that communities should be able to see the benefits from hosting aquaculture and fish farms in their area. But of course we do think that that can be enhanced and improved. So that's where ultimately we set out the outcomes that we want to achieve within the vision there. And I do think that there are opportunities for us to enhance that community engagement element through the work that we're taking forward as part of the consenting task group as well, and I think that will provide the real opportunities to progress with that.
One solution might be to do the similar work that's carried out in communities in relation to wind farm, onshore wind farm development, where there is a community benefit fund that communities can then carry out work within their communities to make them more sustainable and so on. So would the Scottish Government consider publishing a good practice guide on community benefits similar to onshore wind to those engaged with aquaculture? I think you raise a really important point there, because I think that it is important to recognise the benefits that flow through the seabed, the rents of the seabed that Crown Estate Scotland receive. So all of that at the moment is given to local authorities to determine how to distribute, and that is for coastal community benefit. But I do understand that by using that mechanism, it's not necessarily the most transparent in terms of the direct relation between aquaculture businesses and that funding and whatever mechanism local authorities deem to use it in terms of reaching communities directly. So, of course, there are a number of different discussions that need to be had in relation to that. I would say that this was the funding that was last discussed last year. We have an opportunity to discuss that further with Crown Estate Scotland in 2026 and to review how the operation has been going on so far. But of course, another key body in relation to this is COSLA, because that money goes to local authorities. So I think if we were to look at potential changes to that mechanism or a potential change in use for that funding, that would need to be discussed with local authorities as well as with Crown Estate Scotland too. And I think it's also important to highlight, I mean, again, you heard this from industry in their session too. I think they do contribute to funds in their local communities as well, which is separate to this. But I think the main mechanism we have is through the lease of the seabed and the funding received through Crown Estate Scotland, but of course open to considering that and having future discussions on that. Yeah, but that's slightly different from how the community benefit funds work in regards to onshore, where it's not local authorities that deal with that money. It's actually the money comes directly to communities through an agreement set up between the community and the wind farm developer. But the government does publish a good practice guide. So it's not really in relation to Crown Estate or COSLA, it's actually to build up that confidence between communities and the aquaculture industry. So it's actually just a good practice guide, very similar to onshore. Is that something you're considering or looking at? I think I completely appreciate the point that you've made, and I think that's where we're not talking about at cross purposes here in terms of what I've set out. Obviously, I've set out the initial arrangement there because I think, the links between that and the community benefit, I think that could be made more tangible as a result of that. So again, if there are any particular recommendations or points that the committee thinks that we should be considering in relation to community benefits or community funds, then of course we would consider that. Jill?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Ms Goujon's saying. Obviously, the vision for sustainable aquaculture has got outcomes for communities, particularly sharing success from aquaculture, and there's a number of commitments in there around about enhancing community engagement, the consenting system, making sure that we're making best use of any funds raised, and also a commitment to look at best practice principles similar to the other guidance that's there. But there's a package of work in there that needs to be sort of thought through and scoped out in discussions with these different bodies that Ms Cushon mentions.
Thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us in this session. Historically, Scottish ministers have not conducted the kind of cost-benefit analysis required by the Treasury Green Book before making policy interventions around the salmon aquaculture sector. And I'd be interested to understand why that hasn't been done and what steps will be taken in the future to implement a cost-benefit analysis going forward.
I think in relation to the points that you've just raised and the cost-benefit analysis, I mean, ultimately, I think that is done on an application basis and undertaken by the planning authorities, because I think they have to consider all of these different issues in the round. So the economic impacts, the social and environmental impacts all have to be considered and adequately balanced. Environmental impact assessments have to be undertaken as part of that that work too. And I think it's also important to recognise that in relation to the environmental impact of any applications that come forward, SEPA simply wouldn't permit or wouldn't grant a licence for an application to proceed if it was felt that there would be an adverse environmental impact. So I would say on that it is done on a case-by-case basis, because these are really important factors that have to be weighed up by local authorities when they're considering these applications.
The government doesn't think that it's of importance to do a cost-benefit analysis over the whole of the salmon farming sector, in terms of considering what kind of policies you might bring in on the back of our recommendations that we might be making?
I mean, I'm not considering undertaking that piece of work because, I mean, as I've outlined, we have the information about the impact on our overall economy. We want a sector that operates within environmental limits. I believe that with the regulation that we have in place that it does. So, again, I don't see the need for that, for a holistic exercise to be undertaken. And, again, all of these considerations have to be factored in at the application stage.
Okay, thanks.
Rhoda Grant.
On that theme, we're very aware that jobs are hard to find in rural areas, and the jobs provided by fish farms can have an economic benefit in that it allows people to remain within rural areas. What consideration is given to that when looking at planning consents for fish farms?
Overall, that would be a question for the local authorities themselves to look at, because they consider the economic, social and environmental impacts, as I've just outlined in my response to the previous question. But of course, when we're looking at the industry as a whole, I absolutely recognise what you say there, and we can see that. And I know that the committee heard that in evidence from the industry themselves about the impact that that has locally, about the well-paid jobs that it provides in island and rural communities.
Just finally, before we move away from the economic and social benefit, we did have some witness suggesting that we had to be careful that offering money, so along the lines of community benefit funds, where it wasn't be seen as money in exchange for putting up with the status quo. How do we ensure, how does government ensure that it's not perceived as some sort of bribe?
I think that's important. It comes back to the points that I think Jill had made and about the work we'd set out in the vision and the overall work that needs to be done. But I know that this is a consideration that's been raised. I mean, you mentioned convening in terms of wind farms and community benefits from that. I mean, I think always we need to be careful of that as well. But I do think it's a reasonable expectation that when communities are hosting either fish farms, that there is a benefit to be seen from that too. So, and we've talked about already, I think, what industry provides within its local communities, as well as how that coastal community benefit more widely is delivered through local authorities and the funding.
Okay, thanks. Jill.
Just to round up some of the questions that everyone asked, it depends which sort of cost-benefit analysis you're asking, because there's different ways. Cost-benefit analysis of policies in general, cost-benefit analysis of the sector as a whole, or how it's done through consenting. So the way the consenting system is set up is it's recognised there's huge social and economic benefits from the sector, and evidence in that is submitted and considered by local authority planning authorities. But SEPA's framework, the local authorities framework, is set up to ensure that any environmental impacts that would come alongside the development are kept below significant levels. So there are acceptable environmental impacts and you get the benefits from the social and economic side. There are really robust processes in place there, and I think, as Ms Gougeon says, the sector has a lot to do, funds and different things, and we have the Crown Estate Scotland lease fees, but those are separate measures, and it doesn't take away from the assessment that that is an either acceptable impact or it's not, and you can't get your consent without that.
Okay, thanks. We've got a final question on this theme before moving on to our next theme. Ariane, if you could ask your supplementary and then kick off the environmental impacts theme, please.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, so just on the jobs piece, the latest Scottish Government figures show that in 2023 the number of people employed directly in salmon production fell. We also understand that direct jobs on farms were at their lowest since 2018, apparently due to poor performance, automation and farm and company consolidation. And you know, given that there's quite a strong case being made that there's good paying jobs, but then we're getting data, including your own information, that jobs are falling, I'd be interested to hear what concerns you have about that. And, you know, because we have fragile communities, although what I'm hearing is that there's plenty of employment in my region, in the Highlands and Islands, in other sectors. So I'm just a bit concerned that we're pinning all our hopes on a sector where your information is actually saying that the number of people employed is falling.
I think it's important to point out more widely that I don't think it's a case of pinning all our hopes on one sector. I think the point I'm trying to illustrate is that it is economically a very important sector for Scotland in terms of the food produced and in terms of the job supplied throughout the whole supply chain. So you're absolutely right in terms of the figures that were produced, and you've outlined some of the reasons for that as well. And I think, as most businesses are trying to do, it's, you know, as they move to automation, looking to introduce new technology and innovate, that doesn't necessarily mean that or leads to an increase in jobs. But I think nonetheless, it does have an important footprint in our rural and island communities, as well as throughout Scotland, as I mentioned, through the wider supply chain as too. So I don't think that that takes away from the importance of the industry as a whole. But I think for the whole of rural Scotland, and as you've heard me talk about in the committee on a number of times before, when you look across my whole portfolio area, whether that's in relation to agriculture, to fisheries more widely, to forestry, all of these are hugely important industries to rural Scotland. So I think it's not necessarily a focus on this over other areas. It's about we want to make sure we've got sustainable industries as a whole that are providing that valuable employment.
Okay, thanks. And as the convener said, I'm going to move on to our second theme, which is on environmental impacts. And so SEPA has confirmed that it takes up to a year to analyse seabed survey results to assess regulatory compliance. And I'd be interested to hear an outline from you of all the steps that are being taken to actively reduce this time of analysis.
I mean, I think that SEPA had outlined in their evidence to the committee, I think, just why that analysis takes so long to get through, I think because of the very nature of it. So I'm sure that if there are any efficiencies to be made in that process, they would do it. But I think they outlined that in the committee in their own evidence as to why the process takes as long as what it does.
Do you have an ideal target time for getting that analysis through? Because, I mean, the issue is that you've got potentially a problem with the seabed. That's not being analysed. There's an environmental impact. It's taking up to a year to see that. We've got 72 seabed survey results that haven't been assessed yet. Clearly, we've got a problem because we don't actually have proper information and data about the impacts of these sites.
I think, first of all, it's important to remember that at the very outset of the process, I think before any licences are given, I mean, that has to be done within environmental limits, so all of that is modelled beforehand. But I completely understand the importance of the point that you're raising. Again, it's not for me to set a target because I'm not an expert in that field and I can't say how long that work would take. But because, again, that is SEPA's role to undertake that work, and I would expect that they would undertake that as efficiently as possible. And again, they outlined in their evidence to the committee why that takes the length of time that it does. And I'm not too sure there's anything else that we can add further to that. Sorry, Jill.
No, just to say, so SEPA, they will be looking at that, but I think SEPA told you that they have partnered in a collaborative project with funding from the Sustainable Aquaculture Innovation Centre and the Marine Fund Scotland on eDNA monitoring, which is much faster because we do recognise these grab techniques and sifting through samples takes a lot of time. So new technologies like eDNA might be able to really help not only speed up the process, but significantly reduce the costs of all the monitoring that's required as well.
Okay, I mean, that's very helpful, but I think I'm speaking here to Recommendation 29, which said it's essential that waste collection and removal is given a high priority by the industry, the Scottish Government and relevant agencies. It is clearly one of the main impacts on the environment and needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. And that was from the REC report, which is quite a number of years old, as we know, at this point. So the concern is that there isn't urgency. And what I want, I mean, I understand that the eDNA and all of those things are being done, but it has a sense across quite a lot of what we're doing in this work of looking back at the REC report, the recommendations, that urgency really hasn't really played a role. How can the committee have confidence that SEPA has the ability to fulfil its role in a meaningful way?
Well, first of all, I think I would want to respond to that, and I think what you outline is a lack of urgency, and I would hope that I demonstrated in my opening comments, I think, just the amount of work that has been undertaken since the reports, since that initial report, and also the fact we can't forget that, you know, for a couple of years in between that, there was also the significant challenge of dealing with COVID and EU exit in the midst of all that. But I think it's also important to remember, and I think touching on what I said previously, so SEPA introduced their new framework in 2019, which is about helping to guide farms away, guide them towards higher dispersal locations. And also the fact that if there was a concern around that, a licence wouldn't be issued in the first place. I think when licences are given, it's so that the business is operating within environmental limits. So it's important to recognise that. But they're also working with developers. I know that SEPA are working with developers who are looking at, I think, innovations in relation to that, whether that's in waste collection removal systems. And they've also implemented a new charging regime in relation to that as well, to really try and incentivise the use of those technologies too. So I do think it's important to recognise the work that has taken place and that is still ongoing. And as I say, all farms are due to be on that new framework by the end of this year.
Okay, I take those points. I just want to kind of emphasise again the urgency and the concern around the seabed. So the SAMS report from 2018 for the 2018 parliamentary inquiry into the salmon farming said that Scotland's target of producing 200,000 tonnes of salmon in 2020 will likely emit organic waste equivalent to that of about half of Scotland's human population, which was then 5.3 million people. I mean, that is an incredible amount of waste. And the fact that we've got 72 seabed survey results not being analysed makes me really concerned that we don't really have a strong picture, a robust sense of what is going on our seabed.
Sorry, Jill.
I feel, just trying to clarify, I don't know if we're talking a little bit about cross-purposes, because we're talking about the recommendation around about removal of waste, but what we're talking about is seabed impacts, and SEPA has licensed that company to have discharges, and there is waste. Waste is permitted, but it must not have a significant environmental impact. They must improve the seabed within the buffer zones. So the predictive modelling is done before consenting. They say, okay, you can use those medicines, you can have that many fish, this looks okay, this is acceptable within the environment, this is your licence, and then there's the monitoring and enforcement. And the new SEPA regime has significantly increased both the predictive modelling but also the monitoring and the sampling that's been done as well. So it does take time to go through those samples, but as Ms Goujon says, there's the better modelling to predict what's happening before it's licensed, and then there's the enforcement through the regime. But fish farms, the environment can handle fish in the sea, and the waste is dispersed and it can be handled without having those significant impacts.
Okay, I don't share your confidence about waste being dispersed and also the mass, the biomass, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I'd like to look specifically at use of chemicals and medicines. I'm sure anybody if asked would say, you know, there's a need to minimise the use of both. I was interested to see a response from Professor Nick Owen about the effects of treatment using emamectin benzoate and hydrogen peroxide, who told the committee, and I quote, there was a pretty reasonable idea that there was an adverse impact on crustacean species. Pretty reasonable idea. How robust is the data on adverse effects on the different species of the use of chemicals and medicines?
Well, I don't know if officials have further information in relation to the science that's actually taken part on that. But I think what is important is the control of medicines and any chemicals that are put into the environment. And again, I think all of that is considered at the start of a process. I think just through the processes that Jill discussed earlier, to ensure that whatever chemicals or medicines are used, that is done within environmental limits. I think it's important to recognise, though, that I think it's the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, I think they publish the levels, particularly of antibiotics and their use, which has seen quite a significant fall. I think there was a fall of over 50% between 2020 and 2021, and that use isn't really widespread across the industry. I think in marine sites, I think the usage, I think antibiotics were used with about just over 8% of sites. So that, again, all that information is published there, but I don't know if there's any further information that officials would like to add.
Yes, I think it's really important to highlight that there's the UK Technical Advisory Group, which brings together scientists and different experts to consider the science and evidence on the impacts of different medicines, and they made the recommendation on emamectin benzoate, which has been recommended and accepted by Scottish ministers. So there are really robust processes in place, but obviously the science and evidence varies depending on which medicine we're talking about. But emamectin benzoate was specifically targeted and looked at for further work because it was known or considered likely to be more persistent than the other medicines, the bath medicines, which disperse and break down quite quickly. So that there are processes in place to collect science and evidence, and I know that SEPA is committed beyond emamectin benzoate to always review what science and evidence is coming out and what might need to be done and looked at.
Just leading on from that, the SEPA told this committee that only 22 out of 352 farms are currently authorised to discharge emamectin benzoate under the regulations UK TAG in 2022. This is a tighter environmental standard. Only 22 out of 352. That seems a very small number.
Sorry.
Shall I do that one again?
Yes, sorry, I've been allowed to...
Yeah. Out of the 352 farms, there's only 22 that are currently authorised to discharge emamectin benzoate, which are regulated against the higher environmental standard recommended by UK TAG in 2022.
I can explain why that's the case. So there was a science report, I think, by SAMS that indicated that there might be longer-lasting impacts from this medicine that was published. So at that time, new science was commissioned and there was an ask to UK TAG to look at the science and evidence, but an interim standard was put in place for any new farms coming forward at the time because there was new evidence, but we didn't quite know what it meant in the bigger scale yet, but that we wanted to take action to make sure that we weren't introducing new licences on a higher permitted discharge that might be having a bigger impact than we expected. So the interim standard was put into place, and that was for new farms or any farms increasing biomass. So that's why there's such a small number. So there is a large proportion of farms that remain on the prior discharge, but the new recommendation has been made to ministers and that's been accepted. So all farms will be moving to the new discharge environmental quality standard, which is slightly higher than what the interim standard was, which was quite precautionary. So they'll all be moved now.
What's the timescale for that?
4 years.
4 years. So why did the Scottish Government actually opt for that 4-year implementation period? despite evidence of the chemical having poor effects on the environment.
It was ultimately to allow the industry, I think, the time to adjust to that new standard, which of course will be a challenge for them. So it was to enable that to happen.
I mean, is that all that's holding up progress towards the new standard? Giving industry time to adjust itself?
Again, I think given the reductions that some would expect to see, I think we've also got to balance that with the fish health element of that too, and make sure that it's being phased out in a realistic way that isn't going to adversely impact, I think, fish health. Though, of course, recognising that, and that's where how that timescale was developed.
How are you going to measure that progress in terms of both the number of farms that fall under the tighter standards and in terms of the impact of their transition?
I mean, again, all of that, all businesses will have to comply with that by that time period. So that gives them time to adjust. And I think if there are any discussions or any concerns that the industry has in relation to that, of course, we'd be continuing to have those discussions with them.
Now, obviously, enforcement of the regulation is quite an important thing. Now, SEPA have informed the committee that it carried out 3 unannounced inspections in 2023 and that it was planning a further 3 in 2024. That seems to me a wee bit feeble in terms of enforcement. Do you think that monitoring is consistent with ensuring that this is implemented?
I mean, ultimately, I think that's a matter for SEPA to determine based on the information and evidence that they have. I mean, I think it's important to recognise, we've touched on already, I think, about a lot of the modelling work that is done beforehand. There's the monitoring of all of that that happens on top of that too. And I understand that they would undertake that on a risk-based and as I say, just based on risk. So if that's what they believe that they need to ensure that businesses are complying, then I mean, ultimately that's a matter for SEPA, since they hold all that information and they'll be undertaking that monitoring work.
Is it logical that on a risk-based analysis there would only be 3 out of 352 farms that need an unannounced visit?
I mean, again, that would be a matter for SEPA to determine based on the information that they have and the monitoring and surveillance that is already undertaken. So, again, that would be a matter for SEPA.
I mean, sorry to keep at this, but is that level of monitoring actually consistent with recommendation 62 of the report, which called for a significantly enhanced regulatory and monitoring regime under which it will robustly and effectively enforce compliance with environmental standards?
I believe that it would be consistent with that, because I think, again, we can't underestimate the amount of monitoring and surveillance that would be undertaken on top of that too. And again, I think I think, as Charles had touched on in his evidence too, I think that enforcement is the end, but I think it's ensuring that there's compliance is the critical point of that, and ensuring that businesses are complying with the regulations that are in place. And there, of course, are a number of steps that can be taken in relation to enforcement action. So I do believe that I think the initial modelling that's undertaken, the monitoring surveillance that SEPA undertake, I do believe that we have the right systems in place that enable that, and that any enforcement action taken is proportionate to that too. Sorry, Jill.
Just to add, I think what both SEPA and FHI had provided in their evidence was to say that in relation to the current regulations, the sector is actually really very compliant. The SEPA framework, the entirety of the framework, the new framework does introduce significantly enhanced monitoring and modelling and enforcement into that new regime. So that absolutely meets that recommendation. And I think in particular to unannounced inspections, obviously there's regimes ongoing and there's not mass evidence of mass non-compliance, and unannounced inspections can be challenging to arrange sometimes, and there are particular issues, you know, the seabed monitoring, you can't get rid of the seabed, so it depends what's the purpose and the aims of the unannounced inspection, and you would build that on the basis of what you're finding and what the evidence tells you, and risk-based, as Ms Goujon says.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Just regards to the 48 months, 4 years is a long lead-in time to the new standards. Was that done in conjunction with industry to look at their capacity to introduce new thermaliser boats or freshwater treatment, or what was actually the discussions that were held with industry and their inability to respond more quickly? Because again, 4 years seems to be quite an extended period.
I appreciate it does seem like a long time, but again, there was a consultation on the new standard that had been held in relation to that, and I think again the timescale was set, which was believed it would be a reasonable timeframe for the industry to be able to adjust. I mean, of course, as you've mentioned, there are other innovations and other technologies that can be considered as part of that, but I think given the impact of what this new standard would mean, it was felt that that would be the appropriate timeframe.
Okay, just briefly, in regards to the technical standards. Right now, when it comes to ivermectin, where are we when you look at international comparisons? Are we allowing more discharge of ivermectin into the environment now? And in the future, will our standards be ahead of or behind what's happening elsewhere?
I think, first of all, on a general point in relation to comparisons and with other nations, I think it's not always a case of we're comparing like with like. Different nations have different challenges and they address them in different ways, and they're operating in completely different environments. But I think this point came through evidence as well, and I think when it comes to the environmental standards and what we see from discharges in Scotland, that I believe we do have tighter regulations in place here than what exists elsewhere. Sorry, Jill.
Sorry, I was just nodding. Particularly in relation to ivermectin benzoate, we do understand through discussions with the sector and international colleagues that we do think that we have reduced quantities and a tighter standard. But again, it's really challenging to compare because in Scotland we maybe have shallower seabeds and maybe our standards need to be tighter because there's deeper fjords elsewhere, so it's quite hard to compare. But we do get told that our environmental regime is more strict than others.
That's helpful because often, as the committee we've heard, direct comparisons with levels and allowed discharges, but it's very. You're suggesting it's very difficult actually to compare apples with apples. Mm-hmm. Okay. Final supplementary in this section from Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. Continuing on the ivermectin benzoate. So during this inquiry, SEPA sent a letter to the committee showing that it has allowed 196 existing salmon farms to continue discharging the same harmful quantities of ivermectin. In June, the Scottish Government confirmed that this will continue to happen until 2028. In 2017, SEPA did its own seabed sampling and published its peer-reviewed analysis in 2018, concluding that ivermectin benzoate has been causing harm to crustaceans around fish farms in Shetland below the level of current environmental quality standards, and that the result of the analysis have increased the now substantial weight of scientific evidence that the existing standards do not inadequately protect marine life. So if we've got the case that's been made for applying the new technical standards to new farms or proposed expansions, but I'd be interested in, I think, from what I understand, we aren't seeing that being applied to existing farms, and I'd be interested to understand why we're not taking that seriously if that is the case.
I would want to highlight, I think we are taking that seriously. I mean, we've talked already about the framework that SEPA introduced in 2019. So as part of that, there were an enhanced environmental monitoring of the effects of new discharges of ivermectin benzoate on the seabed, and mandatory quality assurance requirements introduced for analysis of that as well. I would say we do take that seriously. We take the advice that we've received seriously. But again, we also have to balance other considerations within that. We'd consulted on that, and again, we've reached the time frame that we have to ensure that there can be that transition and that does take place.
And what we know is that ivermectin benzoate causes harms to crustaceans. And a challenge we face is that we've got so many, like a very high percentage of Scotland's inshore fisheries are dependent on crustaceans for their livelihood. So that's something that's really important to factor in, and a concern that I have, that we are favouring potentially one sector over another and not making sure that those people continue making their livelihood.
I would just want to be clear, I don't think it's a case of favouring one sector over another. And I think I would probably touch back to a point that Jill had raised earlier as well about the importance of the modelling and how all of this is determined and rates that are permitted to be used, as well as the dispersal of that as well. I mean, as Jill had said in relation to waste, there is going to be waste. We know there is going to be discharge. It's about how that's regulated and ensuring that that's within environmental limits, which is hugely important and which is the case at the moment too.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to move on to our third theme, which is farmed salmon health and welfare. A question from Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to you, Cabinet Secretary and others. I'm interested in information about salmon mortality. The Rural Committee's report made recommendations number 9 and 10 regarding levels of mortality of farmed salmon, and stakeholders since then have stated that the mortality rates have remained high, citing 17.5 million fish died in 2022 numbers that were reported. And I know that measures are being addressed or taken to address reduction of mortality, handling of the fish, reducing the stress and things like that. So I'm interested in, can you provide an update about what is being done to address the fish mortality, and are we heading in a reduced number, so heading in the right direction?
Well, one thing I would say is that mortality rates, and I think if you're looking at them over the course of the past 20 years or so, have stayed relatively consistent and at a similar level of about 25%. Now, of course, that's not where we would want that to be. It's not where industry would want those figures to be either. But I think it's always very difficult when we're dealing with mortalities, because it is a really complex issue to try and address. I mean, when you look at some of the issues that I know have been discussed at length with the committee in previous evidence sessions, and I think, whether that's, when you look at the causes behind some of that, whether that's algal blooms, micro jellyfish, there's the impacts of the changing climate and what can be additional threats to mortality. I think it is just really critical that, first of all, we try and understand what the causes of mortality are, which can then hopefully lead to work to try and address that. So, of course, this has been a significant focus, I think, for industry themselves to try and tackle. And, of course, we have the Farmed Fish Health Framework as well, and there's work that's been undertaken through that to really try and, first of all, get to grips with some of the real causes, what are the main drivers that we're seeing behind high mortality rates, as well as standardising reporting in relation to that as well. So I would say it's not an easy problem to try and solve, but improving fish health and addressing mortalities, I think, is a key focus for everyone to try and address. But again, it can be difficult just because of the very complex nature of it and the different causes of it.
And I just wondering, what are we learning from other countries that farm salmon? Canada, Chile, Norway, in comparing their mortality, their causes. Do they have jellyfish issues as well? So that we can learn from other countries about how they manage their fish mortality. I'm looking at Charles Allen as well, so that we can understand, is this acceptable? Is it not acceptable? I'm assuming we want to see a reduction in the number of mortalities in our farm salmon.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's within nobody's interest for there to be high mortality rates, not least industry as well. So I think it is key that we try and address that. Again, there's a number, I think touching on a response that we just discussed in relation to the comparisons between other countries. Again, we're not comparing like with like. We have warmer waters in Scotland than what they do in Norway and the Faroes. The challenges sometimes can be similar, but sometimes they can also be very difficult. And again, our levels have stayed at that, I'd say that consistent level of around 25% that is higher than other nations. But again, the environment in which every nation is farming is very different. So there are a number of different causes in relation to that. But of course, we do engage and work with other nations too to try and get a better understanding and see where it makes sense for us to do so, to work together to try and address those challenges. But Hazel will probably have more information on that.
And just a little bit further, really, which is you heard from from the sector at their evidence to committee the level of sort of interconnectedness that the companies themselves have with internationally. We're looking at international businesses that absolutely learn from their business activities in different locations. And it is absolutely true that both harmful algal blooms and jellyfish were impactful in Faroe and in Norway. And there have been sort of interconnections in the science and interconnections within the companies themselves in terms of how to manage that. But everybody is grappling with similar kind of challenges in that. But there are absolutely environmental differences around our shallower and our warmer waters here as well.
Final question. Is there a magic number for the amount of biomass in a pen? You know, how many is too many salmon, how many is not enough? Because we know that they like to swim together. So is there a magic number? Has that been looked at?
Even in terms of the stock and biomass?
Yeah,
Sorry,
yes,
Charles, you
yes.
want to come in on that?
Okay. If we look at welfare indicators, there is a change in welfare of the fish, round about 22 kilograms per metre cubed. So everybody is farming below that. The organic standard, if I recall correctly, seeks a biomass of no greater than 10 kilos per cubic metre. Most farm fish in Scotland are farmed somewhere between 15 and 20. So well below. But if I understand your question correctly, you know, is there an ideal biomass where mortality is lower? Mm-hmm. I think the answer to that is no. A lot of the mortality currently is driven by either direct or indirect environmental factors. And those environmental factors will interact with the fish, regardless of the biomass. Some of your interactions subsequent to that environmental impact may be affected, depending on biomass. But there is no direct relationship at the densities that we're currently farming fish in Scotland between density and mortality.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Convener.
Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I want to dig a little bit more into mortality because we have a letter, committee members, from Animal Equality setting out just the scale of fish deaths. The highest annual fish mortality rate last year since 1991, more than 17 million fish died on salmon farms last year, over 10 reporting 50% plus mortality rates. Now, nobody's saying that farmers want that many dead fish, but the fact is that there are that many dead fish. So how can we allow growth and practice to continue that results in so many dead animals?
I would say that, of course, again, as I've already said this morning, I mean, mortality is within nobody's best interest, but I think I would struggle to see what other measures we could put in place that could, you know, we can't incentivise against action that, say, I mean, as Charles just outlined, if we see a unique environmental effect that could be, and that leads to mass mortalities at a fish farm, how we can protect against that. And I think that's where the work that goes into trying see what the causes are, how we can try and get ahead of some of those challenges as well is hugely important, so we can try and avoid that, because no one wants to see mortalities, and I think you heard that quite clearly from the industry when they were here as well. So I think it's within all of our best interest to try and address these challenges as best we can, but there could potentially be another environmental factor which leads to that, and I think, as Charles outlined too, I think it would be a concern if there were cases of bad husbandry that were potentially leading to mass mortality, but that's not what we're seeing. It's the environmental effects that can lead to that.
It sounds then like mortality is not under control, or even within the control of the people who are running the farms to a large extent, if we can't say what would prevent such large-scale mortality rates. So is it justifiable for the industry to grow before it answers those questions?
Again, I mean, I think it is really important, as I've outlined, the work that's really critical here is ensuring that we try to get ahead of those challenges where we can. So, as an example of that, I think the Sustainable Aquaculture Innovation Centre, looking at some of the work that they've done on algal blooms to at least try and predict that too. I don't think it's fair to say to the industry that they couldn't potentially establish a business, or that we could, I mean, again, we've set out in our vision for aquaculture that we want to see sustainable growth of aquaculture in Scotland, but I don't think that we can penalise the industry for issues that are out with its control, as you've outlined.
So if industry is growing, but production is going down and mortality is going up, can that be described as sustainable?
Sorry, I think Charles wants to come in and then we'll turn to Hazel.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of issues about disease. You can react proactively, ahead of time, or reactively, after time. So there are a number of initiatives that are taken every year by farmers proactively to control disease. I'm thinking here about vaccination, suitable stock selection, that your stock is well adapted to the environment. There is no getting away from the fact that 22 and 23 were really harsh years for the farming community. There are indications, and they are indications only, and we can't rely on them entirely, that survival in 2024 may be better. But you were asking about, what can we do to address some of the issues. I think collaboration is a very, very important thing. A lot of these companies are working in more than one country, and they see different things at different times. So flow of information within companies, between companies, as an industry, but also collaboration between governments, so that we understand better. It doesn't necessarily help us eliminate, but can help us to understand the issues and pressures.
My point was just going to be around what constitutes growth. I think you heard from the sector as well. They're not necessarily looking forward to physically to grow the number of sites that they're farming, that kind of stuff. What they're looking for is greater efficiency within the spaces that they, within the quantum that they currently can occupy. So looking for sort of greater efficiency, greater productivity within the space. So it's not about growth in kind of in mass and scale in that kind of way. It's about improved productivity within the existing sector, and that will mean addressing some of these challenges that we're beginning to see that we are seeing, rather, that are having the impact on mortality. And I think you heard them set out quite clearly some of the sort of scientific activity that's going on around addressing harmful algal blooms that Ms. Goujon's talked about as well, and around looking at jellyfish and exploring how best to sort of literally take the sting out of that as an issue as well. So there's work going on to address the very specific issues that are kind of headline in this area too.
Okay. Hazel had said there that the industry doesn't want more farms at the moment. So if that's not the goal, would there be harm in pausing growth in the number of farms until there is greater control on mortality and on disease and on fish health?
Again, if you're talking about like say a moratorium on that, I mean, I don't think that would be appropriate, and I don't think that would be a means to tackle the challenges that we face. I mean, we've outlined some of them here, and again, a lot of that is about what we can do to try and mitigate against some of these challenges, and there is already so much work and so much investment going into that. So I think you could set a target, you could set set a moratorium. It's not going to change the work that needs to happen or that is already underway.
Okay.
Could I expand a little just on my point within that, which is it isn't necessarily about staying in the same sites that they are in. I think they all recognise a sort of a desire to make sure that that the farms are located in the most useful locations in terms of fish health and that kind of stuff. So we've talked already about higher energy sites, that kind of thing, looking at the siting of those farms, preventing people moving sites around, or best organising their marine estate for the efficient production, but also for the best health and welfare outcomes as well. So there's the way the planning system works. If we constrain that, say by trying to prevent the expansion in the number of farms, you would also put limitations on businesses' ability to organise their estate in a way that will meet everybody's aims in terms of health and welfare and in terms of productivity.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds reasonable, but the committee has heard from industry that there are sites operating right now that industry itself recognises aren't in the right place. And work hasn't been done to move those sites. So is there really trust in the industry to make those tough decisions and move farms which just aren't sited correctly for fish welfare?
Sorry, Jill.
Yeah, I think there's evidence from farms elsewhere, and it's known in the sector, and that's why we're trying to support the sector moving into more exposed, and those may be close to shore, but still more exposed, which are better for environmental impact and also can help fish health and welfare. We know that there is a recommendation around relocation and farms in the REX report, and I think it was important at the time to recognise at the time that that was written. The farms that are in place just now, they are there because they're permitted to be there and they're operating to their licensed conditions, so they're allowed to be there, and they're there's nothing to say that they need to move because they're complying. However, we recognise that what layout we have just now is not the most efficient and people want to move, so we think it's really important to try and put in efficient mechanisms for them to be able to do that, and that's why the work of the consenting task group that Ms Goujon's established is really important, because it's trying, the new sites still need to be fully assessed, but it's trying to make sure that the consenting system is streamlined and it's coordinated to help with some of these consolidations. And then we're also doing the work on the offshore framework to help fish farms move into even more exposed waters. So there's a range of factors that need to come together, and I think the sector reported on the investment on their freshwater wellboats. They want to use their large smolt strategies. They're doing nursery sites. So there's a big change in the way that production is being managed, and we're trying to do our bit on the consenting system to support that and move it along, because fish farm cycles, they're 2 years long. It takes time to get consents in place. It's not a really quick thing.
To that and further themes to explore it a little bit more.
Yeah. Apologies, Convener. I think the questioning goes its own way. Mr Allen, I note that your comments around mortality are strikingly similar to those that you made to the REC committee in 2018, and I wonder, had you been asked then about giving evidence today, if you would have imagined that things would have improved more by this stage and you would be able to speak to a better picture than we actually have at the moment?
Well, whilst an optimist, I also have to remain a realist. I would like to have seen mortality decrease, survival improve. But I would also reflect on the fact that the nature of the mortality has changed. What we have seen are things emerging, which we didn't have in 2018. So the nature of the mortality has changed, and whilst the figures for, or the last published figures, are less than seen in previous years with regard to survival, long term there is still a fairly straight line survival. I would like to think, sitting here in 2024, and whilst not wishing a repeat invite, if I were to speak to you again in a few years' time, the situation will have changed.
Just on that, do we need to be a little bit more honest, a little bit more realistic, a bit more pragmatic about mortalities? Are we really ever likely to make massive improvements in the percentage of fish dying? And should we be comparing? Should we maybe looking at survival rate You know, in farm salmon, the survival rate would be significantly higher than it is in the wild. So do we, you know, it's the narrative around the whole thing. It seems pretty unpalatable that we have 17 million fish. But it's a bit like comparing apples with apples. We're not talking about sheep or cows or whatever. And the whole life cycle of a fish, whether it's salmon or whether it's wrasse or whether it's pollock or cod or whatever, is completely different. So rather than trying to defend what, on the face of it, would be pretty unpalatable and unacceptable levels of mortality, is it not time the industry and the government took it on the chin and was honest and actually admitted that these levels of mortality are to be accepted and we just need to get over it, and that's how it's going to be? Because it's completely unrealistic to look at, you know, 10% mortality or whatever, given the current, you know, where we are with science and technology and innovation.
I think we are quite honest and transparent about where we're at. But I would disagree in some aspects, because I think we have to be optimistic about our ability to be able to address these challenges. And I don't think we can be complacent and say that 25% rate of mortality is good, because it's not. We would all want to see improvements from that. We would want to see improvements from that. Industry certainly would want to see that situation improved.
Sorry, can I interrupt? So what's your benchmark on 25%? What makes 25% mortality okay, but 35% not okay, or 15% not good enough? How are you benchmarking it, given the public perception about the life cycle of fish is completely different from the life cycle of a cow or a chicken or whatever? So where are you benchmarking that 25% that it's okay to lose, again, 17 million fish?
Sorry. No, again, I think I don't want to get, and I think the committee actually asked me about this in my last appearance as well, about what an optimum target would be. And again, I don't think that's a helpful conversation to have. We're not content with where we are, and I think that everybody is striving to do better and to see that improve. I mean, and again, you've got to be optimistic about the ability to try and address some of those challenges, and that's where the investment in the science and the work that's being taken forward there is so important. You know, I mentioned the work that SAKE is undertaking in algal blooms to try and predict where that might happen again. There's the investment in technology in relation to micro jellyfish that we've seen more widely used in other countries, so that we can also use here too, to try and address some of these challenges. And it's also important that we look ahead and we're trying to get in front of whatever is coming next, because there will always be another challenge coming down the line. Hazel.
Yeah, just to expand slightly on that, which is that from our point of view, in terms of it's about making sure that we believe everything is being done that could be done. And there will be some things that are unavoidable. We've talked about environmental impacts that were unpredictable on farms, particularly in that 2023 year. But it's looking at making certain that we have the sector, the science, the regulatory frameworks all in place to collaborate around solutions to that. If there was an indication that we were not doing everything that was possible, well then there might be a question to be asked there around what more could be done. But I think if we are looking at sort of ticking through the actions that can be undertaken to address particular threats as they are understood, well, then we are working as hard as we can in the circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Convener, just continuing on the theme of mortalities and also picking up on questions that Emma Roddick had brought, I would be interested if you could explain why the Scottish Government and Marine Directorate isn't identifying farms with repeated high mortalities and requiring them to either downsize. We had extensive discussion about the moving of them, but I'm interested in the downsizing of them or actually closing them to prevent further unnecessary suffering. And also, why isn't the Government and Directorate requiring fish farming companies to reduce mortalities in each cycle? So we've been talking about this 25%. Why are they not being required to reduce mortalities in each cycle to achieve a humane level, probably within about 5 years? Why isn't the government taking those measures? So interested about the downsizing and the closing and the reduction to a humane level?
I think there's a few points in there. I think I would touch on the response that Jill gave earlier, I think, about all the other package of work that's underway. And I think that touched on a point that Emma Roddick had raised about the appropriateness of sites and how that could be looked at. And again, there's a package of work underway in relation to that. On your point about requiring to reduce, I think I would just struggle to see what the purpose of that would be. If, for example, you say like an environmental challenge arises that couldn't be predicted, how you then deal with that, how you deal with those situations where it is out with the fish farm's control as to what could be an increase in mortalities. Again, I think that there is no bigger incentive for the industry than already exists at the moment to reduce mortalities. It's not good, not least in terms of fish health impacts. It's not good for the overall business and from an economic point of view either. It is within everybody's best interest to address mortalities and, as Hazel said, to ensure that we are doing everything we can to tackle mortalities. And when it comes to the scientific work addressing the causes, doing that work too and trying to get ahead of some of the challenges that we know will continue to come down the line.
Okay, just coming back to, so Ben Hadfield from Maui was here and he talked about wanting to get to 5%, but doesn't the Marine Directorate and the Scottish Government have some kind of role in supporting them to move to that humane level?
Again, we would support the industry in their efforts to reduce mortality. I think that's a given. And we do that through the scientific work that we undertake as well. And I've talked about already some of the examples of the funding that we've provided and the work that's underway. So, of course, we would work with industry to do that.
Okay, and then just coming back, because I feel like that got skipped over, my other part of the question was around downsizing or closing in the meantime, while we try to get to grips with the unnecessary suffering that's happening in these fish cages, in these fish farms.
I mean, in relation to downsizing, I think, as you'd heard in response from Charles, I think in terms of the causes of the mortalities that we've seen recently, it's not the stocking, it's not the biomass of that has led to that. So, again, it's why would you be downsizing? And it also always comes back to what has been the cause of the mortality and how can that best be addressed. And I don't think you are addressing the causes by either downsizing or closing businesses, again, when we're dealing with the wider environmental challenges.
But we come back to kind of the opening recommendations around moratorium, because things are clearly in a problematic state in the industry, and by downsizing and having less biomass, less fish in the cages, we could potentially get it to a more manageable situation.
Again, but even if you did all that, you're not addressing the real causes of what are causing the mortalities. And again, I would come back to, I think, Jill, the response that Jill gave earlier about the consenting task group work, again, of SEPA's new framework. All the work that has been done in the meantime, and I think since the last report, has all been critical, because it's about ensuring and guiding fish farms to the most appropriate areas for them, where there are less of some challenges that we know exist in the environment. Sorry, Hazel.
A small addition, which is industry react year to year on how they stock their farms in any case. So they will make a decision about whether it's appropriate to restock that farm at whatever level it was, if it suffered at a particular issue the previous year, based on the intelligence they will have about whether that risk is likely to arise again. Because I come back to the points Ms Goujon's been making about mortality is in nobody's interest, least of all the farmer, for all kinds of reasons. So that they will not want to stock a farm where they think the same issue will be a significant problem for them again. So I think some of it's already in there in terms of that pressure on them.
Okay, I'll leave it there, but I don't necessarily take that as the case. I don't have the information right in front of me, but I am aware of farms that have been restocking that have had problems, and I will pull that out and make sure the committee is aware of that. Thanks.
Thank you. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. It's just a final question to pick up about how in the REC report, micro jellyfish weren't mentioned as a cause of mortality, but algae blooms were. So, and what Charles Allen was saying was there's emerging causes of mortality that are different now than what they were decades ago. And so it's almost like you're going to be chasing your tail. But I think my question would be that the government does need to continue to work to collaborate with the researchers and the scientists and the Marine Directorate and support any action because it will be difficult to keep ahead of the challenges. But that would be my ask, as the government obviously recognises that collaboration and support will be required. So will that be the case?
Oh, absolutely. I think we have to do that if we've got any hope of trying to address the challenges that we face going forward. And I know it is a really high priority. And I think in terms of the wider challenges, we know we'll face more going down the line. We're all aware of the situation in our marine environment of warming waters, trying to get ahead of the challenges that climate change presents us with as well. And I think just an example of some of that work, we've been engaging with the Marine Climate Change Impact Partnerships to improve the understanding of climate impacts on aquaculture, because it's that working with our stakeholders is important, but I think working across the piece and internationally is also really important too, so that we can share that knowledge and ensure that we are using the most up-to-date science, and we're engaged in that work to try and tackle these challenges as best we can.
Okay.
Grant.
Thank you, Convener. And this is really quite interesting, the discussion about, nobody knew that micro jellyfish were going to happen. And it had absolutely devastating impacts on fish farming. It was the equivalent to foot and mouth, but people maybe don't understand that, because we saw firsthand, people saw what was going on with foot and mouth. They didn't see the devastation of the micro jellyfish and the impact that had on those working in fish farms, and indeed the ongoing impact that's having on folk down the line in the processing industry as well, who have lost their jobs. So we've talked a bit about what the industry can do about maybe looking to where the next threats are coming from. But I wonder what the government is doing to support them in that, and what they foresee as being the issues. Because if we're ready for them, within a year, there was understanding of the micro jellyfish and how to farm around it. And there's other things I think we'll come to that we could maybe do to mitigate the impacts even further. But I just wonder, what are the new threats and what action are we taking to avoid them?
Yeah, I'll hand over to Hazel in a moment, who will be able to say a bit more about that. But I think just to touch on your initial point there, I would absolutely agree with that. In terms of how we're supporting the wider industry, I mean, there's obviously the Farmed Fish Health Framework and the work that we're taking forward through that. So there was work on mortalities that was done there. I've already touched on today the work that SAKE had done, the Sustainable Aquaculture Innovation Centre, in relation to algal blooms, which I think was a really important piece of work there. And we fund SAKE, we're funding them with providing them with funding of £1.5 million up until 2026, and to try and fish health priorities are really key in the work that they'll be taking forward and focusing on. And in relation to micro jellyfish, I'm aware there are other technologies being used elsewhere that can try and help alleviate the issues with that. But Hazel, I don't know if there's more information you'd like to add.
You've covered most of the ground there. I think the role of government is to facilitate these collaborations fundamentally, and we do that via the funding that we provide to the Sustainable Aquaculture Innovation Centre and the ways that we're thinking into the future to continue to be able to support innovation, and through the Farm Fish Health framework that creates that space for pre-competitive conversations between companies, the international collaborations. We also have the Quint, which is the connection between governments at official level internationally as well, and various science international collaborations that Charles probably has in his head as well there. To enable the industry to come together, to enable the scientists to come together, to think about these things. And that's the space that we as government officials certainly occupy.
Okay, thanks.
At this point, I think it's probably a good idea to have a break before we move on to data accessibility and transparency. So we'll suspend the meeting until 10:30. Okay, well, we'll now continue our question on the back of the aquaculture report, and we're going to look at data accessibility and transparency. So recommendation 11 of the REC Committee report considered it essential that work and mortality reporting ensured high levels of transparency that would provide confidence to all stakeholders, and it recommended that the information provides accurate, detailed and timely reflection on the mortality levels, including their underlying causes across the whole sector, and that's something that we've spent some time discussing. So given how important I think everybody appreciates accurate reporting mortality, why has the Scottish Government not introduced a mandatory system to report mortalities, but relies on the industry reporting them on a voluntary basis?
First of all, I would say that in relation to regulation, we need to make sure that it's proportionate to what we need. I believe that the information that we get right now is suitable for those purposes, and we are provided with that information, and it is provided in an open and transparent way. And I believe that across the industry, they are more transparent about the information that they publish, and more information on mortality is published than any other nation, as far as I'm aware. I think I would also just touch on, I know that I mentioned earlier the work that had been taken forward through the Foreign Fish Health Framework in relation to trying to identify the causes of mortality, and I think that's a really important piece of work, because it identified, I think, 10 overarching categories with a view to standardising the reporting across farms as well. So there's been an improvement in relation to the data because of that, because it makes sure that there is that consistency of reporting as well. Now, again, I recognise that there are still further improvements that can be made, I think, just in terms of how the overall data is presented, because right now we are still presenting it in 4 different ways. We have the mortality levels that the industry presents, the Marine Directorate. We publish our own information annually. There's information that the FHI reports and also what SEPA reports as well. So we have 4 different ways that information on mortalities is reported, and I think that that's one thing that we've discussed and looked at to see. I think it would be helpful for us to provide an explainer as to how all the different categories of information are used and how that can then be explained, because I do recognise that further work needs to be done there.
I think the biggest concern is that, and we've heard it's about consumer confidence and public confidence, and the fact that the information currently is provided on a voluntary basis does, and it has given rise to some concerns about the accuracy of those figures. So what's to prevent government saying, laying out some of the issues you've just raised in your answer there, and suggesting they're actually legally reporting on the basis that you suggest would be helpful, and there's progression being made, because it's that confidence in the data that we found in the committee has been lacking. We're all very aware of the reporting mortalities prior to the fishing, the aquaculture industry representatives appearing in front of this committee, and some of the questions were over, the accuracy of that, whereas if it was a legal obligation and not on a voluntary basis, there would be more confidence in that information.
Again, I think there's 2 separate issues within that. One is about the presentation of the data, where I think absolutely we need to do more work in terms of how that's presented and communicated as well. But again, all the information that is provided, it's open and transparent. And I think if you're to look at regulation or law, it comes back to, well, what is proportionate? And again, the information that is provided is open and transparent. I think industry talk themselves about the various audits that are undertaken in relation to how transparent they have to be with that data. And of course, records have to be kept, and there would be surveillance of that too. So I think we are confident in the information that is provided. If it transpired that there was a problem, then of course that is something that we would look at. But again, any steps we take with regulation have to be proportionate.
Okay, thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. Just kind of following on from that, I'd be interested to, and I heard you say that you think the Government and Marine Director has more work to do in terms of the the data and reporting and things like that. But there's a number of things that have come up for us. So at the moment, it remains impossible for the public to check on fish farm compliance around bath chemical discharge licences, and SEPA has produced no compliance assessment scheme reports, for companies since 2019. But another thing that's come up is that data is given in different ways. So SEPA and the Fish Health FHI use different metrics, so not always comparable. And surely it would be a fairly easy and reasonable step to address that discrepancy. Could we get a commitment from the Scottish Government and Marine Directorate to actually move forward with making all of that data not only publicly accessible but coherent, so it's really easy for the public to actually see if a particular farm is compliant?
Again, there's a few points within that as well. I think you talked about SEPA and their compliance assessment and the fact that they haven't had that. First of all that information is published, but in terms of the specific compliance assessment, that's work that SEPA are going to be introducing next year. So they'll be able to show. So the levels are published at the moment, but in terms of compliance, that's work that SEPA are actively working on and will be taking forward next year. Again, in relation to our overall, I mean, I've talked about like you say, it can be difficult for people, I think, to extrapolate the information that they need or make those comparisons because of the data and the way it's presented. And it's collected in those ways for different purposes and for the reasons for each of those organisations. So as I said, for whether that's the industry themselves, what we need that data for in the Marine Directorate, what FHI need it for, as well as what SEPA need that information for too. Now, I just mentioned there about the work we could take forward in terms of an overall setting out a document that can help explain all of that information and help bring that together in a better way. Again, all the information that we have in general in relation to aquaculture is published on Scotland's Aquaculture website. There could be, I think, more work done in relation to that overall in terms of the ease and accessibility of information, but that comes back to a prioritisation discussion. Again, all the information is published on that, but again, if we were to, I think that would be potentially a very expensive process to do in terms of a website or an IT overhaul in relation to that. And again, I've outlined some of the pieces of work that are ongoing at the moment in relation to the consenting task group. We've had SEPA and their sea lice framework being implemented, so it's how that work would fit in relation to our overall prioritisation. But again, I think there are steps that are being taken to make more of that at least more communicable. SEPA are introducing their work next year, and we'll be working on trying to get an explainer together for, particularly in relation to the mortalities data.
Okay, I mean that certainly would be a part of having social licence, wouldn't it? Be to have a good relationship with communities and presenting that information in an accessible way. Yeah. Just on mortalities, one of the things that's come up through our inquiry and talking to all the different regulatory bodies is that there isn't really anywhere where mortality kind of sits. So we heard from Charles Allen when you came in with your different hat on, I think it was a different hat, that the Fish Health Inspectorate, for example, doesn't have power to limit production following a high mortality event. So I'd be interested to understand, so this is related to recommendation 10 of the REC report, which is about that there should be a process in place which allows robust intervention by regulators when serious fish mortalities occur. So this is also about gathering that data, getting that information. So if there's nobody that's really having the powers to oversee that, I think there needs to be something done there, and I'd be interested to understand from you, Cabinet Secretary, how you would define a robust intervention and where could that intervention sit so that we actually get that clarity and that data around mortality.
Again, I think it comes back to the overall causes. I do think I talked about there is a whole heap of information that is published, so it is open and it is transparent in terms of how it's reported. But again, I think everybody, as I've just outlined, collects it for a different purpose, which is why it's set out in a different way. Now, I wouldn't want there to be any sort of interpretation that that means that there's a gap in regulation. I mean, we covered the mortalities in the previous set of questions there and about interventions. Now, the Fish Health Inspectorate, I'm sure Charles will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but if that was, we've talked about the environmental causes of that. Now, if that was caused by a listed disease, the Fish Health Inspectorate then have the ability to to take action in relation to that, where those powers are set out. But again, when there's an environmental cause behind, like some of the issues that we've talked about there, the harmful algal blooms, I mean, that is an issue that is out with the fish farmer themselves and out with their control. But Charles, if you could just explain a bit more, I think, about the powers in relation to, I think, listed disease, or where that's been seen to be a problem.
Surely, any case of listed disease requires by law to be reported to ourselves. Any mortality or any increased mortality has to be reported either to ourselves or to a vet. And that is to seek clarity on the cause of mortality. With regard to mortality recording, all mortality occurring on fish farms requires to be recorded and that record to be available for inspection. So whether we are present during a mortality event or immediately after a mortality event or further into the future, that record requires to be maintained. Where that mortality is increased, the farmers will report that mortality to us. So we have a report at the time. We have a mortality record held on site, which can be inspected by an inspector at any time, to allow us to better understand the pattern of mortality.
And you have confidence, just in general, in data in general, kind of back to kind of conveners' points around the voluntary basis of the nature of reporting on this data. I mean, it's quite concerning, potentially, that you have an industry that's marking its own homework, which is a phrase that gets used a lot in this building.
I don't think that's the case. Sorry, Charles.
It may be an opinion that they're marking their own homework, but they're actually voluntarily reporting data to us above and beyond what the law requires. So it's a provision of extra information rather than marking their own homework on what is legally required.
Okay, I'm still not sure I'm getting the answer around that recommendation around robust interventions in the situation and that recommendation, but I'll leave it there. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Just sticking with reporting, the Scottish Government's vision for sustainable aquaculture enables further expansion of the sector as long as it operates within environmental limits and with due regards to animal health. So what indicators do the Scottish Government use to monitor whether the industry is operating within environmental limits and with due attention to animal health?
Well, I think when you look at the industry as a whole, I think we talked earlier, just at the start of the session in a great detail, I think, about the work that goes into an application and the licences that have to be received, and the fact that if there wasn't the amount of modelling work that's undertaken as well to ensure that fish farms are operating within environmental limits. So by that very nature and by the fact that they've been granted their licence to operate, it's very much on that basis.
But once they're in operation, how do you monitor and what indicators do you actually use to ensure they're operating within the parameters that you set out, which would allow further expansion of the industry?
I mean, again, we talk in the vision about we see the potential for sustainable growth of the industry, again, within environmental limits. But I think if you're, I mean, we did touch on that earlier in the session as well, about in relation to the monitoring that's undertaken, the surveillance of that is very much part of the work that SEPA undertakes as part of its 2019 framework.
Okay, so are you satisfied that the industry is currently working within these requirements, which, in your view, does allow further expansion? And how do you assess the industry as a whole? So I say once again, your vision was for it to be able to expand, but how do you look at those indicators to ensure that it is expanding and able to meet its obligations?
Well, again, I think individually they must be able to operate within environmental limits, otherwise there wouldn't be licences granted for that. But I would come back to, I think, some of the really important pieces of work that have been undertaken since the committee's previous inquiry. We talked about the SEPA 2019, that their overall finfish framework there, the implementation of that. There's the sea lice framework too, and the further rollout of that, which is going to take place over a period of time. Now, between these different exercises, we can identify the areas where there are challenges, and I think that all comes back to the work that Jill touched on earlier too, and that the committee may touch on in its questions later about the consenting task group and the work that's being taken forward there. We want to make sure that any as the industry, or that we're looking to guide development to the right places ultimately, which is what we're trying to achieve through these frameworks and through this work. So again, some of that work is at the initial stages, but I think that is the gradual, that is the general direction.
So you're comfortable that the environmental standards and animal health that the industry is operating at the moment is in a position that it can expand?
Yes, I believe if you're looking at specifically talking about the regulation that we have in place, I believe we have the right regulation in place. We have very tight environmental standards. We care about our fish health and fish welfare too. So yes, I believe that the industry adheres to those standards that we have. If we believe that that wasn't the case, we have the mechanisms to try and deal with those issues as they arise.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry, Jill.
Just to add to the end of that, the vision obviously sets out a number of outcomes and how we're going to progress those, but the vision itself isn't setting the environmental limits. Those are very much within the different regimes, because we need to keep up to date with the latest science and evidence and adapt those. So the urgency about the new environmental framework and the significantly enhanced monitoring, that's one element. The environmental quality standard for slice or emamectin benzoate will be reset and farms will be sampled against that. The Fish Health Inspectorate has introduced sea lice I'm going to leave the wording wrong, intervention levels of 3 and 8, and they've been revised and brought down. So we're constantly reviewing and setting what is the acceptable limit, and that feeds into the sea lice risk assessment framework as well. That framework is very much going to be adaptive, so learning from the monitoring that comes in. It's just so there's not just one set of markers, there's lots of different bits of the regulatory regime that we're setting and reviewing and making sure that it's up to date with the best available science and moving in line with our desired outcomes.
Okay, thank you. Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder how the Cabinet Secretary would respond to concerns that there are no statutory welfare standards in place specifically for farmed fish.
I would say that we have, I do believe that we have the adequate regulations and law. We have the Animal Health and Welfare Act that businesses would be required to adhere to as well. The Animal and Plant Health Authority deals with any issues in relation to that as well. I believe that they've also recently appointed some more people specifically to work in that sphere as well, and to ensure that they have the capacity and the resource that they need to undertake that work and undertake that role.
I think it's been clear during the inquiry that witnesses both from the industry and who are critical of it have struggled to define what good fish welfare is. What is the understanding within government of what good fish welfare is and what happy fish would look like and behave like? And do you see it as the role of government to provide that definition for the industry to adhere to?
Well, I think it's important that, as in any areas, we have the right protections in place to protect and enhance animal welfare, and we should always be striving to try and improve that where possible. And in fact, there's a number of pieces of work that have been undertaken and that we're actively considering at the moment. I think the Animal Welfare Committee in the UK, I think that was particularly about the welfare of fish at the time of slaughter that we're considering. Again, we always look to, if there are areas of improvement where we can look to do that, we can. But again, I believe that when you look at the totality of the provisions that we have in place, the legislation, policies and the operational practices, I do believe that we have the right safeguards in place to help us to be able to safeguard the health and welfare of farm fish. And as I say, it's the Animal Health and Welfare Scotland Act 2006, which places that duty of care on fish farmers.
The REC Committee did identify issues relating to the regulatory framework. How has the Scottish Government sought to fix those issues since that report?
In relation to animal welfare particularly,
yeah.
Yes, well, I think it's important to recognise, and I think as we've touched on throughout the committee today as well, obviously there are a number of different bodies involved in the regulation of salmon farming as a whole, from the Fish Health Inspectorate and their specific role, SEPA, in relation to the marine environment. We also have as I've already touched on, APHA and their work in relation to welfare issues. So I think, like anything, what's really important is that there is that strong collaboration. Of course, each organisation has its own specific role that it has to undertake, and specific laws and regulation that it has to either enforce and monitor. So I think it's really important that there is that close collaboration between the different organisations in that place. I'm sure that, and I think that the FHI and APHA have been in discussions about how to better collaborate on some of those issues. I don't know if that's something that you're able to say more about, Charles.
Certainly. Both directly and indirectly, APHA are responsible for the welfare of the animals with regard to statute. And they have inspected, they have veterinarians, they have vets who inspect farms of all sorts to consider animal welfare and animal welfare cases. But we will also refer cases to them directly where we have found on farm cases that we think are worthy of further inspection with regard to welfare. It's a constantly evolving relationship. And indeed, just last week, we referred a number of cases to APHA. But we're looking to develop the understanding that the other needs to improve welfare services that are provided to farmed animals.
It must be quite hard to regulate and enforce good welfare standards if there isn't consensus on what good welfare is for farm fish. So is there an objective or desire, aspiration to come up with farmed fish specific welfare standards?
I mean, as I say, in relation to the overall provisions and legislation that we have set out, I believe that we have the right powers in place, again, to be able to deal with any issues. And if the committee have any particular recommendations in that regard, I'm happy to hear it. And of course, we're always open to considering where any potential enhancements to animal welfare can be made. But again, that's not an intention to take forward work in relation to that at the moment. I've already mentioned some of the recommendations that came from the Animal Welfare Committee in the UK in relation to that, and that's what we're actively considering and looking at the moment. But again, I think overall, in terms of the legislation and policies we have in place, I believe that they allow us to be able to deal with that.
If I could just add a few more points onto that one. The 2006 Act does have some specifics about what constitutes good welfare, but I think you're looking for something sort of beyond that. And within that, there is kind of an ecosystem of understanding there in terms of what is good practice that is documented in the sector's own code of good practice, things like the RSPCA assurance standards and other assurance standards that all inform this. And welfare indicators, there is a sort of suite of information out there that AFA uses as part of its work, and they will have their own methods of ensuring that they have adequate measures of that. So I think there's probably some questions for AFA there and how they manage that in more detail.
I think it's when the committee went to visit a fish farm, the 2006 definitions were up on the wall, and various members had asked questions about how those are adhered to, particularly around allowing animals to explore their natural behaviours. I suppose where that can't be directly applied to fish which are in containment, would it make more sense, including for those who are having to ensure that welfare, that the standards are applicable and achievable for the animals that they're looking after?
Yes, again, and I think if there's any particular recommendations in that regard, I'm open to considering that.
I just want to understand, so you've quoted the Animal Health and Welfare Scotland Act 2006, but farm fish are not covered by that. You know, we heard evidence from One Kind that as sentient animals protected under Animal Health and Welfare Scotland Act 2006, farm fish should have statutory welfare standards. and official guidance, but they currently do not. And RSPCA have suggested that all their schemes are voluntary accreditation scheme, and yet all the fish farms actually are working at an enhanced level above legislation, because there's no legislation that exists which looks at the welfare of fish. Indeed, there's no KPIs on the data to monitor welfare standards, because the RSPCA said it's incredibly difficult to measure welfare. So you've touched on the Act and a couple of times, but farm fish are not covered.
They are covered by that Act. Sorry, Hazel, I don't know if there's more you want to add.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
They are?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's good to get on the record. Thanks. We'll move on to a further question then from Tim Eagle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'm acutely conscious that I wasn't here for a lot of the evidence-gathering sessions on this, so I'm quickly trying to pick up what's going on. One of the concerns, I think Charles actually spoke about this a minute ago, was the coordination between Fish Health Inspectorate, the APHA and local authorities when we're investigating cases of general welfare protections under that 2006 Act. And just those concerns, actually that coordination was a bit iffy, to use a phrase. Have you got any thoughts on that and how that could be improved?
Yes, well, I think as Charles was outlining, I think there have been those discussions about how there can be that greater collaboration, and also outlining, I think, obviously I think if there are particular cases that are picked up when FHI are undertaking any inspections, then they would refer that to APHA. But of course, I'm always open to consider how we can potentially strengthen the role of APHA when it comes to protecting fish welfare in Scotland. But again, I don't know if there's more you want to elaborate on, Charles.
I think I would only really add that we're continually working to improve our relationships with other statutory bodies, whether that be APHA, SEPA and the like.
Just specifically, do those bodies at the moment have any powers to do unannounced inspections?
Yes.
Yes.
My understanding is yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Question from Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. Just following on Tim Eagle's questions. So what we know is that fish welfare is the responsibility of Animal Plant Health Agency, APHA, but apparently APHA investigates only a small subselection of reports of poor animal welfare on fish farms, and that's if the Fish Health Inspectorate and occasionally third parties notify of high mortality events. And it doesn't always inspect even the farms with the highest mortality. So that's quite concerning that we have this body, APHA, that's required to investigate, but they're not really doing that many investigations.
I think I'll touch on a point that I'd made earlier, that I think that APHA are increasing their capacity in this area as well. I think they're adding a couple of members to their team, if my understanding is right, to ensure that they can undertake more work in that regard.
So could you come back to the committee with a kind of a measurement at some point that shows what they're investigating now, and then with more resource, what they will be doing in the future? I
mean, I'd be happy to contact APHA and furnish the committee with that information, if that would be helpful.
Great. Another point that's come to my attention is that we received this letter from HPHA that implied that it issues care notices to farm operators who need to improve fish welfare, and that it prosecutes the most wayward of them. But APHA has acknowledged in an FOI disclosure that it has never actually issued any care notices to salmon farms, and that there have never been any prosecutions of fish farmers for failing in their duty to prevent unnecessary suffering, or failing to meet an animal's needs. So that's interesting, because there's kind of implication in the letter we received that they do issue them, but actually they've never issued any. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Again, I don't have that information to hand, and that's something that I would have to check with APHA. But as far as I'm aware, they've been dealing with a number of cases over the course of the past couple of years, some of which are still ongoing at the moment as well. Sorry, Jill.
I just want to add that the fish health inspectors are obviously on site and will liaise with APA and report if they've got any concerns to APA, and APA follows those up. But APA are also specifically vets, they're veterinarians, so they've taken their oaths, and there was a discussion at one of the previous committee sessions that high mortality doesn't necessarily equal poor welfare, and it's very complicated between the two and welfare indicators. So there are vets that are going out, and I think the lack of, or your suggested lack of care notices, it is around the fact that they've been out, the vets, the fish farm vets have done their best, their duty of care, and there hasn't been a break in the law by causing unnecessary suffering.
Okay, and how would anyone know that? How's that tracked, that they've gone? Is that coming back to public data and transparency? Is that something that's on the website?
Yeah, there's. I'm actually not. Yeah, I found the information in my pack now about the recent cases for AFRA in recent years. So since 2022, they've had 22 complaints of welfare abuses from third parties, including from the Fish Health Inspectorate. Of those, 20 were investigated, 12 resulted in action, which either included verbal advice, written advice or follow-up. So they haven't got as far as the care notice level, because those earlier levels of action has not meant that they've needed to do that. 3 complaints remain under investigation. There may be more up-to-date data than that, and we can absolutely speak to AFRA and get that clarified. But that's the information they had provided to us ahead of this session.
Okay, you said 12. You read that very quickly.
Sorry,
so
apologies. I think we can provide more clarification.
Yeah, but just on the 12 that have resulted in
12 resulted in action. Which
and what were the actions?
It included verbal advice, written advice, or follow-up.
But what?
Again, we don't have that. Yeah, but we'll provide the committee with further information once we've received that.
Thank you. Just on that again, we did have information to suggest that research in salmonid species have shown that they're capable of experiencing pain, and that there has been operational laboratory welfare indicators that are developed to highlight that, but there's no legislation to implement any legislation around sticking to the indicators. Is that something that the government are considering bringing in?
I've not been considering that at the moment. As I say, I think we have the right measures and policies and legislation in place at the moment. But again, as any new evidence emerges, we're happy to consider that.
Okay, thank you. Elena Whittam.
Many thanks, Convener, and good morning to the panel. I'm going to focus my questions around about the use of so-called cleaner fish and also interactions with wild salmon. So we know that the industry has explained to the committee that they use cleaner fish, so wild caught wrasse and farmed lumpfish, to help them deal with sea lice infestations on the farms and try to keep that at bay. But what we've heard from witnesses is that the mortality rates for these cleaner fish are unacceptably high, with almost a third dying within 3 weeks of being deployed into the marine pens. And also at the end, when the salmon are harvested, the majority of the cleaner fish are also killed. We have heard from the industry that they're making strides to try and address some of the issues with regards to welfare for them, using wellboats, etc., to try and minimise stress and death. The REC committee did have several recommendations. So recommendation 26 was about the urgent need for an assessment of the future demand, as well as all associated environmental implications of the farming, fishing and the use of cleaner fish. And recommendation 28 was to look at the urgent need for regulation of cleaner fish fishing to preserve the wild stocks and avoid negative knock-on impacts to local ecosystems. So my question really does focus around about both the environmental impact of it and also the welfare impact for the so-called cleaner fish. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to respond to the concerns regarding the high mortality rate of cleaner fish, and also if you can update the committee on the Code of Good Practice commitment and the vision for sustainable aquaculture and how this could address the concerns, and finally whether a code of practice is better than regulation, or whether regulation is needed in this area.
There's a lot to unpack in that question, so I'll try and work through it as best I possibly can. And I know that this was an issue that we actually touched on at the session that we had with the committee last week in relation to fisheries management plans too. And there are a number of pieces of work going on in this area. I think, first of all, just to say that I recognise the concerns that have been expressed to the committee about this as well, and obviously concerned by the evidence that the committee's received. So I would just want to point, first of all, to the fact that in relation to the welfare welfare of cleaner fish, we've asked the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission to do some work on that. So I'm not too sure exactly what the timescales are for that work, but I'm happy to furnish the committee with that information as soon as that becomes available, or when I have an idea of timescales of that and what that's going to look like. And I think it's appropriate that that's how we handle that, and that we get the recommendations from the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission and to see what improvements can be made in that area. But there has also been, you touched on recommendation 27 within the report. So obviously since that time and since the report was published, there have been a number of different measures that have been introduced within that time. So first of all, we did have voluntary measures, I think were introduced in 2020. Those measures then became mandatory in 2021. And as part of those measures, what was required as part of that was, it was really about additional data collection, really looking at the number of wrasse that was caught, the requirement to take part in surveys, and really trying to build that evidence base. And I think what we've seen as a result of that, I think we're still working through the review of that from 2023 in terms of that last year's data. But I think what we've seen, I think we've been content with what we've seen through the mandatory measures. So again, but that doesn't mean that the work stops. I mean, especially when scientific evidence, and we've been in receipt of further scientific evidence since then. So as I covered at the committee last week, we're currently waiting on advice from Nature Scot on the back of the evidence that we received about potential impacts on special areas of conservation, and that's to enable us to undertake an appropriate assessment under the habitats regulations. So I would just want to highlight with that there are a number of pieces of work underway so that we can try and get to grips with what the issues are and address them in the best way possible.
It would be very helpful. I mean, that report was from 2020, so it would be really helpful if the Cabinet Secretary could update the committee going forward in terms of, what's going to come out of that report and how the issues that are raised in that report are going to be addressed. I was wondering if you could actually touch on the Code of Good Practice commitment and the vision for sustainable aquaculture, just to give us an update on where we're at with that.
Hazel will be able to provide more information on that.
So that's referring to the Sexes Code of Good Practice, which is something that they continually sort of keep under review, and we will work with them in more detail on the updates that are required to that. I think they've been working closely with us and with the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission around the sort of recommendations that go into that, and I think that further updates to the Code of Good Practice it'll make sense to do that holistically once the information comes out of the Animal Welfare Commission work.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move on to a few questions around about interactions with wild salmon, if I may.
Sorry, Eleanor, just before we move on, we move away from the topic of wrasse. It is my understanding that there's currently a petition on wrasse being assessed by the Public Petitions Committee. The Scottish Government put in a late submission which suggested they were now in receipt of a report titled Assessing the Implications of Wrasse Fisheries for Marine Sites and Features, which brings new evidence of potential wrasse fishing interactions with special areas of conservation and MPAs. Now, this report was written and received by the Government in 2020. So to suggest it's now in receipt and of new evidence, I would suggest it's disingenuous at its best. It also follows on from a PQ which was written by our committee member Ariane Burgess relating to appropriate assessments and whether they've been carried out, to which the response was the Scottish Government does not hold information you have requested, which is obviously untrue given the report was published in 2020. So why has there not been more progress on wrasse, given these issues were first raised in 2020?
Again, I have talked about the progress, and I think since 2020 we introduced the mandatory controls in that time, and I think it's also important that we review the evidence that's come through those mandatory controls. So, as I say, we have the evidence from 21 and 22. We're still working through the data from 2023 and publishing that. In relation to appropriate assessments, I mean, they wouldn't have been carried out, and I think that we're waiting on the advice from Nature Scot to then inform the appropriate assessment that will take place.
But I suppose I'm asking, why has there not been anything done since 2020 when Nature Scott published their initial report?
Again, I would have to go back and look at the exact timescales. I mean, in relation to the receipt, what work has been done on the receipt of that report, and I'm happy to follow up with the committee in relation to that. But again, we have taken action since 2020, and I would just want to be clear on that, and we are taking further action as I've outlined.
Okay, my apologies, Elena, for interrupting you. If you do want to continue with your line of questioning, thank you.
That's no problem, Convener. Thanks very much. I just want to touch on some issues surrounding the interaction with wild salmon. So the government did publish their Scottish Wild Salmon Strategy in 2022. It's broader than the aquaculture impacts, but refers to pressures on wild salmon from farmed salmon. I would like to touch on some of the issues surrounding the Salmon Interactions Working Group. So they have said that in their recommendations, only one of the group's 42 recommendations have been acted upon by the Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretary, can you explain what has delayed progress in delivering the group's proposals and when we can expect to see these implemented?
First of all, I would just want to highlight in the area of wild salmon, there have been some quite significant pieces of work that have been taken forward within that time as well. And the delivery of the sea lice framework, I think, is one of the really key and really critical pieces of work to be taken forward, which I think is really a positive step forward in relation to managing those interactions. Also in identifying who the lead regulator in that work would be, and of course SEPA are taking that work forward. But I would also say that in the time since the Salmon Interaction Working Group report, we've introduced a wild salmon strategy. We also introduced a wild salmon implementation plan on the back of that. The strategy outlined about 61 different actions, identified the different pressures that wild salmon are facing, and the implementation plan is really about setting out the actions that we're taking in response to identifying the different challenges we know our wild salmon face. And we also published an update on the first year of the implementation of that, and I think there's been action taken against 50 of those 61 actions. Now, I do recognise that I think the criticism that we get that progress isn't fast enough, but I would just want to highlight that we have taken significant steps forward, and I think it has been really critical that we've driven forward these pieces of work because we recognise just the pressures that our wild salmon are under. But of course, there are a number of different factors we know contributing to that as well, which we identified within the strategy. I think about 12 different pressures, and it's important that we take action against each of those to try and really boost those populations as best we can.
Thank you. And sticking with the subject of sea lice, how would you respond to concerns that we've heard that SEPA's approach to placing standstill or no deterioration conditions on farms in wild salmon protection zones assumes that the current sea lice levels on those farms are not harmful? We've heard that this approach is actually, perhaps baking in further deterioration. So how would you respond to that?
One thing I would want to be clear about overall is I think we've got to look at the SEPA sea lice framework holistically, which I do think takes that precautionary approach. And I think where the areas that they've identified and the fish farms within that and that standstill and condition, it's really about getting more information to inform the modelling and to see what the actual impacts of those fish farms are. So I think it's really vital that work takes place to really try and discover what the exact risks posed by those areas is. And sorry, Jill.
Yeah, I can just provide a bit further detail on the framework, which it's essentially using best available evidence, some of which is modelling science, some of which is science on the thresholds above which wild salmon might start to occur. And it's created this risk screening tool, which is precautionary in nature because it's an initial risk screening tool, and then it assesses where further developments need more detailed assessment. But what that has done is it's essentially modelled the entire west coast of Scotland, and we've been able to zone in on areas of highest relative risk. So there's areas that the risk is really minimal. We've now got our targeted focus areas, of which 19 farms have been identified of highest relative risks, and those areas will get standstill conditions to make sure that farmers are maintaining good sea lice controls that they've had in the next couple of years while monitoring. An assessment is done and we determine whether we need to take further action on those farms. I think you've also heard from people that the science relating to interactions is really quite complex. So we are using best available evidence in line with the precautionary principle. And that's exactly what the framework does. It's a risk management tool which is, implements adaptive management, and we will adapt to what the monitoring is telling us. But it's our best estimate based on the science and evidence that we've got at the moment that will work.
And that's very helpful, Jill. That leads me to ask a question around about the prevalence of no count. So if we're looking at having robust data and understanding the situation, Cabinet Secretary, are you concerned about the level of no counts that have been submitted for mandatory sea lice counts? And does this, help or hinder the robustness of the data that we hold?
I mean, I do believe that the data that we hold is robust. I mean, I think that Charles, in his evidence to committee previously, I think had outlined the various reasons as to why that might be. I think if it did look like it was an ongoing or a persistent issue, then of course I'd take further or see what further could be done in relation to that. But I do believe that we are in receipt of the data that we need.
Just to add I think a lot of the discussion on no counts has been looking at the Fish Health Inspectorate's regime, and there are reasonable reasons for no counts within that, and that's been discussed, I think, in quite a lot of detail at committee. SEPA is obviously bringing in this new regime, and it requires a look at the reporting at a different time of year and over a shorter time period and for a different purpose. So SEPA is having a look at what is required, but it will be introducing reporting requirements, and it's starting to do the standstill conditions now. So they may feel that they have different requirements for the reporting, so that might look slightly different. So we can't really comment on what's gone in the past in relation to whether that's good enough for the framework, because SEPA is setting what's good enough for their framework now. So I just wanted to clarify.
Thank you. I have one final question surrounding escapes from fish farms. And back when the REC Committee put out the report, the recommendation 37 noted that there was strict penalties in Norway to deal with escapes and recommended appropriate sanctions should be developed and introduced in Scotland. The Salmon Interaction Working Group at that time endorsed that recommendation and called it actually a powerful recommendation. And we know that they're also seeking for the monies that would be accrued from any fines to be ring-fenced and actually given over to the improvement of wild salmon conservation. So could I ask the Cabinet Secretary how and when will the commitment set out in the vision for sustainable aquaculture to introduce appropriate fines for the fish farm escapes be redistributed to support the wild salmon conservation and research, and when's that going to be achieved?
I mean, as I outlined in my opening comments, we realise that there is always more work to be done, and this is one area that we agreed with those recommendations and that we do still intend to take forward. However, as I've also mentioned in the session today, it has been about how we are prioritising the work. And I think overall it was felt that, well, we do have a regime in place for escapes at the moment, so the priority was on addressing where there are potential gaps. So that's why work on sea lice was a focus and taking that forward. There's also the work that we're doing on the consenting task group too. So it's not possible for me to set a definitive timescale at the moment, but just say we are still intending to deliver that work. But again, it's a case of factoring that in alongside all the other work that we're taking forward at the moment.
I mean, this is something that the Atlantic Salmon Trust has told the committee is quite vital in terms of protecting wild salmon numbers in Scotland. They're concerned about the genetic integration that could happen there. So I'm wondering if it's possible for the Cabinet Secretary to come back to the committee once we have further understanding of what the actual prevalence of that genetic integration may be.
I don't know if it's helpful. I can provide more information, I think, on the work that's been done in relation to that. Sorry, is that where you were coming in, Jill?
Yeah, there's probably more than two things, but we have an existing escapes framework which it is trying to assess the risk and stop the risk of farm fish escapes. So that is already in place, and there's inspections to make sure there's satisfactory measures in place to contain fish. we had committed to look at the technical standard, which sort of governs equipment and how wave heights and thinkers assess to make sure things are in place are going to withstand the environmental conditions. So we committed to look at that. And the first technical standard came in 2015, and there has been upgrades in equipment, and overall escapes generally have been declining. The risk of all escapes is not equal, so it really depends on the size of the fish, whether they disperse immediately to sea. So we have made progress to invest in further integration sampling. So we've had our first integration report for Scotland. The next one should report, I think, by spring next year. I need to double check the timeframes on that. So we're building up the evidence base of integration that is occurring. And that is not to say that we are seeing good, so we remain committed to the Pentis, but we are seeing good practice by some farming companies already. So Maui, after escape in Carradale, spent money on monitoring and research to determine whether there was any actual impacts from that escape event, and they didn't actually find any evidence of integration. So the sector is starting to do it, but we have the commitment to take it forward as well.
Thank you.
Okay, Elena. We're now tidy up this theme with a question from Tim Eagle.
Yeah, it's just the final question is what is the status of the 2023-24 programme for government commitment to pilot a revised technical standard for Scottish finfish aquaculture?
Yeah, I think Jill just touched on that in her previous response there, because we know that the last technical standard was 2015, so starting the initial work.
Yeah. It is taking us slightly longer than we expected to do, and as Ms Goujon says, it's been part of prioritisation decisions that we've had to take internally in government, so we are still committed to it. And essentially the discussions around are about the best way to implement, whether that's through guidance or through other means. So we're just taking the time to make sure that we get that absolutely right, and we can come back to you on timescales.
Okay, thank you.
On to our final theme, you'll be pleased to hear, Cabinet Secretary, on consenting and planning, and a question from Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. As a response to the Griggs review and indeed concerns from the industry, the Scottish Government set up the Consenting Task Group, and I wonder what progress they've made in looking at streamlining the consenting process.
It was one of the key recommendations that came out of the report, and has been a key focus of our work going forward since the recommendations were published. So I'll hand over to Jill in a second. I think he'll be able to talk through some more of the detail. Obviously, that work has been taken forward in phases, and as you say, there were a number of the key reasons why that was being taken forward is really about trying to streamline. I mean, as we've heard today, there are a number of different bodies. It is quite complex, I think, particularly looking from the outside in at all the different requirements that are expected of fish farming businesses as well. So I think it's really important and that we're able to streamline that, make that as efficient as it possibly can be, and obviously look to learn and improve through this process too. So, Jill.
So the Consenting Task Group has worked, it was formed in 2022, just after the Scottish Aquaculture Council. It worked over about a year together to try and interrogate and pull apart what happens at the start of the fish farm consenting process. We did take the time, we had to learn about different ways we could fit the system together, but we're also taking the time as a really important component of this work to build trust and bring people together and build consensus in the way forward. The regulatory report was really helpful in directing that there's success comes from multilateral good pre-application activities. The individual components look okay, but this needs to be coordinated and managed in a much better way. So that's what we set out to consider. So we've operated in the pre-application space because that's where the report directed us to do. But we have essentially designed a process which runs the SEPA consenting process and the local authority processes together. And what happens is there are two case officers identified, one from SEPA and one from Highland, that run the entire process together. SEPA takes hold of the first element, which publishes an environmental risk assessment report combined with advice from local authorities and other statutory consultees on issues that might need to be considered through the consenting system. That report is published online, and the ask is on developers to engage with communities, third parties, other interests on that report. collect any information on whether there's any additional issues that they consider should be considered through the consenting system. And it's really important to get local stakeholder knowledge at that stage, because SEPA or the local authorities, they might not know the location of local knowledge relating to specific protected species, for example. So that sort of information is really important. And it also is driving early engagement between the sector and others at the earliest stage possible. Once that report is finalised and the community engagement has come back, the local authority takes the lead on the environmental scoping. As you can tell, it's a bit of a detailed and technical process, but the whole point is that it gets people together early on in the pre-application phase. It coordinates what's happening. By the end of that process, all of the potential constraints should have been identified. There should be agreement on what is required to be monitored and collected as evidence to support the application, and everybody should know where they stand in relation to that. So the follow-on application process should follow really smoothly. So although we have lengthened the process in some ways, we're absolutely trying to streamline and coordinate it so that things are running in parallel rather than after each other and happening at the same time. I think we also recognise that a lot of people comment on SEPA car applications on issues that are relevant to local authorities and vice versa, so having them work together in the space will be really, really important.
That sounds more complex than streamlining, to be fair.
Yeah, the intention is streamlining around. I mean, we've obviously we're working with the sector to explore whether the exemptions for marine licensing is being used. What had been reported to us is that fish farms were applying for different things at different times in a linear rather than running in parallel, and it was taking a long time and the bits weren't speaking to each other. So we're working on the let's run them in parallel and let's make them speak to each other. We want to go on and have a look at EIA processes, because there's been reports that there's duplication in there, so we do want to streamline and make sure things are absolutely targeted as possible, but we need to maintain the robustness of assessment and community engagement, so that's what we're trying to do in this process. We've got the pre-application process that's working well. We've got 4 pilots currently underway. We've got a bit of independent evaluation on the initial process that we've come up with. But as I say, we want to move on to look at EIA and also the onward application process, so exactly following the same principles. Who are the 2 case officers? How can we run it in parallel? How can we consult at the same time so that from the outside it looks like a singly managed case flow process that is running at the same time, not in bits?
Okay.
I hope I explained that well.
So you're evaluating it. I mean, how are you evaluating it? What looks like success? What's your timescales? If it looks like success, if you've achieved what you were looking to achieve, when will it be rolled out?
Yeah. So we had 4 outcomes for the consenting task group around about removing duplication, making sure there was opportunity for community engagement, and that was embedded in the process and it was enhanced, and ensuring the overall robustness of the process. So we'll use those to evaluate it. We've appointed an independent evaluator, Aquaterra, who's doing some evaluation process for us, and I think they will report in February and March. But I think a key message is that this is a continuous improvement project. We've been meeting constantly to evaluate how things have gone, because we've brought new processes, new templates. We've got different applications doing slightly different things. So we'll learn from those, and once we've got the independent evaluation, we will meet with the consenting task group to discuss whether we want to continue in Shetland and Highland, if we need to repeat more pilots, or actually if we want to pilot in new areas. And the intention is very much to design a process that works for everybody and that can be rolled out Scotland-wide.
When, I guess? This sounds like it's almost like a rolling programme with no real time frame within it.
I will be more informed on that once we get the evaluation back, and we've discussed that with the consenting task group.
I'd be happy to provide the committee with that information as soon as that becomes available. I mean, I appreciate the concerns you're expressing about the potential timescales for that, but again, this is a new process that we're working through, so I think it's really important we take that time to get it right and to do that evaluation, and then to see what potentially further rollout could look like from there.
Okay, thanks.
Matt Harper.
Thanks, Convener. I was going to ask what Rhoda has just covered about the pilot process, but I'm just noting that the consenting task group met 9 times in 2023. It was established in November 22, and it seems to have met in May this year and that's all that is on the government website. But I'm just wondering, is that because the draft consenting pilot process is now, that's work that's underway, and so until you evaluate that, there doesn't need to be further meetings in 2024, and maybe what's the next plan?
I can be probably very honest, but that was to do with resources. So we've got our next meeting in November at the end of this month. I would have expected us to have a meeting in between, but we'll meet at the end of the month.
Okay.
Yeah, just to conclude that, the industry representative said that there has been a lack of progress. So there's obviously some urgency around it. So some indication of when these pilots will be concluded and reported on would be really helpful to the committee, and also whether. Can you say whether the government are likely to report on the findings of these pilots and what further action they're taking on the back of the pilots? When are we likely to get that report?
Again, I'd be happy to furnish the committee with that further information in relation to the timescales and then what future iterations of that work will look like.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, convener, and good morning, colleagues. We heard the REC committee, the REC report recommended introducing mechanisms in the planning system to enable the relocation of fish farms to more environmentally and economically suitable locations. And we heard from industry representatives that they were disappointed that swift action hadn't been taken following that recommendation. We heard from Ben Hadfield from Mowi Scotland, who said there's no mechanism for dealing with a situation in which it's been identified that the relocation of a site would bring about a series of environmental and or economic gains. So could the Cabinet Secretary indicate why this recommendation has not been implemented?
Again, I think one thing I would point to is and it comes back to a response that was given earlier in the session, and you've just heard at length there about the work that's been taken through the consenting task group. And when we touched on this earlier in the session as well, I think it's important to point out that this could potentially be a future iteration of that work and how we take that forward to look to whether that's moving sites. I mean, they would still have to go through that application process. But again, that could be part of a future iteration of this work. Because, as I say, the overall theme and what we've been able to express today is that ultimately we want the right development in the right place, and that's how the frameworks that are being developed are really looking to aim towards and really ensure that we have that. So that will continue to be a work in progress.
Okay. So could I ask what your response is to concerns that environmental management plans accompanying planning decisions are not being monitored or enforced?
In relation to... Oh, sorry. I don't know if there was...
I was just going to say, what other mechanisms does the Scottish Government have in place to allow these sectors to discuss and resolve disputes?
In relation to environmental management plans, I mean, ultimately that's a matter for local authorities because it's up to them to monitor and enforce that. I mean, I would say that environmental management plans were ultimately designed to be that interim measure between the delivery of the sea lice framework, which has just been implemented, and as I say, that's going to continue over the course of the next few years. So I think there's the discussions around what that transition looks like for where environmental management plans are in place. But again, ultimately, it's up to the local authorities to enforce the environmental management plans.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rhoda Grant.
Just on that, and we spoke earlier about things like micro jellyfish and the like. Would it be possible, and this was something we spoke about when we visited fish farms about actions taken to avoid the micro jellyfish, would it be possible to have some ability to move fish farm cages out of, so when you know that there are micro jellyfish in the area that are coming towards the fish farm, to be able to move that fish farm, and given the planning consent and where you put fish farms to is so complex, would there be the ability in an emergency to move them? We heard about fish being moved, but obviously if you could move the farm, that might be less traumatic for the fish.
I think it very much depends on whether that would be something that was a temporary measure or something that would look to be more permanent. But Jill, more information.
Yeah, no, absolutely that. I think if it's something, I think with these events, I don't actually think the sector gets much warning sometimes, if at all. So I think what you're describing is probably looking at a potentially temporary measure. I have to admit, I think that would probably be quite challenging because it's not actually a very, as far as I'm aware, a quick task to move an entire farm, but there could be definitely discussions that, and then Ms Goujon's outlined that for the longer term, relaying the layout and the efficiency of the estate, we still need to assess the new locations if they're to be permanent, and that's where they're to go, but trying to work through the consenting task group to make sure that's efficient as possible, because we can see the gains for everybody in freeing up space that farms don't want to be in anymore and improving environmental and fish health performance.
Okay.
And back to Shetland with Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. Can I ask about sorry, I actually thought somebody else was taking that question, but that's okay. Is this the marine planning one?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I wonder if you could give an update on the implementation phase of the marine plan. I understand that Shetland's still waiting for formal adoption from ministers to enable this.
In relation to marine planning, obviously that's being led by my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero. I'd be happy to provide a written update in relation to the status of the Shetland plan, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that would be helpful. And and how will the Scottish Government ensure that planners have sufficient data and understanding of the offshore environment to consider the suitability of locations and risks of unintended consequences to animal welfare?
I think that's where the processes that we're talking about are so important. I mean, I would highlight, first of all, that not just related to aquaculture, but there has been a whole piece on planning that has been taken forward and looking at a whole variety of issues in relation to that. Again, I'm more than happy to provide the committee with that further information, and that's being led by colleagues. But I do think the consenting task group work is important here as well, because it's about bringing all these bodies together at an early stage and sharing that expertise.
Thank you.
Eagle.
It's just to pick up a wee bit on that offshore, because it was something that was in the REC committee report previously, wasn't it? And it kind of seems to make sense in that there's a bigger water flow potentially, but there are risks that come with that. Have you got any early thoughts on? I say early thoughts because obviously we'd hoped that maybe it progressed. And there's clearly quite a lot of work to be done here, and I'm not quite sure on what timeline, but just what are the Scottish Government's thoughts around that at the moment, and whether we can almost, is that worth fast-tracking, or have you still got these concerns about how that will impact upon wild fish stocks, etc., etc.?
I think it absolutely is, and we'd set that out in our vision as well. So, and that's an area we're really keen to look at and try and progress. So we actually have a consultation that's open at the moment, which is about the planning, extending the range of the local authorities' planning powers out to 12 nautical miles, because it's currently only up to 3. I think there had been discussion about that a few years ago, but it wasn't extended at that time because I think we weren't really considering, offshore development in that space. So, as I say, the consultation is open at the moment until about mid-December. I do think, because I've been to... when I went to Norway last year, I went to visit one of their offshore fish farms, and it was really interesting to see that kind of development. And I think that was the first place in the world where they had an offshore site, which I think, from what we'd been able to see and the evidence there, was that it was better in terms of the environmental impact and also had positive impacts on fish health and welfare as well. So it is a new area for us, so that's why this consultation we're undertaking at the moment is important. But again, I think that the benefits of being offshore, higher dispersal sites, and again, but we just have to consider all these issues in the round and ensure that it's going to have a positive impact on fish health and welfare too.
Could I just
sorry, Hazel.
Just to say that the definition of offshore is a really interesting question.
Yeah.
You can achieve some of these benefits that you might be looking for from offshore via higher energy sites that are closer inland as well.
Okay.
So, and you've already got companies looking to do that. So. Cook in Shetland I'm aware of, but there will be others who look to utilise different sites for different purposes, and they're thinking about energy flow as much as they are, physically how far from the land we are as well. So I think there's nuance underneath that word offshore that is worth being aware of as we go into the next stage.
Okay.
Just a couple of questions, and it's supposed to do with the capacity of local authorities. So there is a lot of weight put on local authorities when it comes to planning, but also enforcement. And earlier on we touched on animal welfare cases. So just before we move on to questions from Edward Mountain, can you just clarify what the role of local authorities is when it comes to referring welfare cases for prosecution? And, you know, given all their obligations, do you have confidence that our local authorities have the resources to do what's necessary?
I think that ties into a couple of points, and I know I said in response to Beatrice Wishart I'd write with more work that's being undertaken in relation to planning, because I do think, as I say, it's not specific to aquaculture, but I do think it's relevant here. There was a consultation that was undertaken recently, and that was ultimately about ensuring that planning authorities have the resources and the skills that they need, as well as looking at other matters around fees. I do think the consenting pilots will help with that, though. I think it's about, because it's identifying a lead person both in SEPA and the local authority to take this forward. So I think it would be helpful if I sent more detail, because obviously that's being led by ministerial colleagues, but I can provide more of that information because I think it helps address some of those problems.
Okay, that's helpful. But is there also capacity issues within the Scottish Government? Because we received correspondence from Loch Long Salmon Company where a planning application for a semi-enclosed caged farming system, which is innovative and might address some of the issues we've got. It's been sitting with the Scottish Government for 2 years and still waiting for approval or otherwise. So is there also an issue within the Scottish Government when it comes to planning issues?
I mean, I can't comment on that because that's not an area I deal with, and that would either be led, I presume, by the Planning Minister, who would be taking a determination on that. So, again, it's not for me to comment.
Okay, thank you. Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Convener. And I'm sorry, going at the end means you have to sometimes go back to areas that you've covered before. I'm sure you'll understand that. I just want to recap. I'm delighted that you said in your evidence that global warming is facing a key issue or a key problem for the industry and how they dealt with it. But this report that the REC Committee wrote in 2018 was based on the evidence then. And I'd just like to remind you of the evidence given on the 2nd of May by Ben Hatfield, and where he said, and I'm going to quote this, where a 7% mortality rate in the seawater phase would be top of the pile, and where it was in Scotland from 2009 to 2011. Since then, we've had a perfect storm, he wrote in a letter to the committee. We have had El Niño conditions which raise the Atlantic temperature and warmer seas and coastal areas. And at that stage, when he was writing to the committee, mortality had just drifted above 15%. Ben Hatfield went on to say, mortality will decrease and it will get better. So that's the basis the report was written on in 2018. 2023, we find a 25% mortality with 33,000 tonnes of salmon being disposed of compared to the 17,000 tonnes that were being disposed of in 2018. Do you think if the committee had seen that report or knew those figures were coming, they would have written the report slightly differently to the way they did in 2018? I
mean, I'm sure Jill will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think when we look at the overall mortality rates over what we produce in our surveys and that survival to harvest over the course of the past 20 years, it's remained relatively consistent in that time. And I don't think it detracts from the fact that we all want to tackle the serious issue of mortalities in the best way that we possibly can. And as I've stated throughout the committee appearance this morning, it's not within anybody's interests to see such high mortality levels.
I accept that, but I mean the fact of the matter is that mortalities gradually increased, and 2023 was perhaps a bad year, and this year may be slightly better because it was somewhat cooler, but it has increased. And we heard from Ben Hatfield the other day when he gave evidence to the committee that he was confident to be able to predict a 2% drop in mortality every year. That's the figure they're looking at getting at Maui, which would mean to get back to the 2018 figures, we are into about 5 years. And if we want to go back to the 2009 figures, we're looking at a lot longer than that. Do you think the industry's got to speed up its reduction in mortality, or do you think it can be allowed to just continue as it is?
I don't think it's a case of industry. I think they're already doing everything they can, and we're assisting in some of that work, as I've outlined today, to drive down mortality as much as it's within our control to do that. I don't think there could be a bigger incentive than there is at the moment. I don't think that, again, it doesn't make economic sense. We don't want to see it from a fish health perspective either. So again, it could go down, but that could change depending on the environmental conditions at the time. So that's where the work that I talked about, I think, is so critically important. It's about, first of all, identifying those challenges where they exist. What can we do to try and address those where they do exist, as well as then trying to predict what could be the next one that's coming down the line.
As a farmer, Cabinet Secretary, I understand that mortality happens when you're farming animals. But, if we've seen mortality more than double with the way industry is doing it, if that was happening on land, farmers wouldn't be able to get away with it. And I certainly would say to you that recommendation 9 of the REC Committee's report, which I remember discussing at some length, it says that the committee is of the view that no expansion should be permitted at sites which report high or significantly increased levels of mortalities until these are addressed. That was a key recommendation which prevented the committee endorsing recommendation 3, which is a moratorium. Has that happened? Has recommendation 9 happened?
Again, we're dealing with issues and mortality events that are really complex to address. So I don't think it's fair to necessarily say there should be no expansion where there's high mortalities, or penalising fish farms where that has happened, very much depending on what the cause of that might be and where it could be completely out with the farmer's control or out with the control of anybody at that site. Again, because of the nature of these, and some of the events that we've seen that have led to the high mortality rates are ones that we couldn't have predicted and are now trying to address.
Sorry, can I just come back, Cabinet Secretary, on that? And the industry were predicting problems with the diseases that we're seeing now in 2018, and they were being talked about. So we did know it was happening, and we do know as farmers that, for example, on land, if you're suffering from pneumonia in a cattle shed, you don't just keep stocking the cattle shed. You do one of two things. You either vaccinate the calves against pneumonia, or you increase the ventilation in the shed. What's happening is the industry are continuing to go back to the same sites where there are problems and restocking them.
I think it's really important, first of all, that we're not conflating different issues here. I think it's a very different issue if you're dealing with mortalities that I say, and we touched on earlier, that are because of a disease on that site, or a listed disease in relation, or ones that in relation to the environmental concerns. Like I say, you can't predict. But sorry, Jill, you want to come in?
I was just going to say, I think you said that mortalities had doubled, and Ms Goujon's outlined that they have actually maintained relatively consistent. The figures that we have just reported were higher than what had been the average previously. And of course, we can't speak for Ben Hadfield. It's great if he's got those targets, but I think what the main message coming from the sector was that they have just published this fish health plan. They've invested a lot in fish health and welfare, and I think what we're saying is we've progressed the fish health recommendations that we've had on sea lice, on mortality reporting. We've discussed the challenges about closing down sites with high mortality one year and not another year, because it's really quite complex, and I think we remain committed to working with the sector through some of those issues. They've got large smoke strategies coming through, they're investing in their freshwater wellboats, and we're trying to do the work in the consenting to allow them to move where things aren't quite working, so that all needs to come together.
Okay, so Joe, I accept the point you made, but where we are, we've gone from 7% by the industry's figures in 2009-2012 to 25%. Those are the figures. So you can talk about whether the numbers are more or less. My concern is that if I'd known where we were going to be 5 years later, I would have been one of those committee members who voted for a moratorium on expansion for the industry until the problems have been resolved. So I'm not sure how we disagree with the figures that the industry themselves are putting forward. Do we disagree that it's gone from 7 to 25%? We do disagree.
I think Charles
disagree.
I think the 7% which is being quoted is not an industry number. as in an industry-wide number. I think it is a subset.
So what was the figure if it wasn't 7%? 12%?
I can't remember off the top of my head what the mortality rate or the rate of survival was in 2020. I'm sorry.
No, 2020, I'm talking about the figure in 2018.
Even then.
Or 2009, 209. You see, this is where we're boxing with figures we don't know.
We have got figures for industry as a whole. I can't recall it, but Scotland industry as a whole, I don't think has ever had a survival of 93%.
I think we would have to be clearer on exactly. Again, I realise that you're choosing or you're picking out evidence that had been given at the committee at that time. I think we would need a fuller understanding of exactly where that figure came from at that time to know that we're comparing like with like in terms of data, rather than, I think we're getting into a bit of a discussion about the figures here that aren't necessarily comparable.
I kind of hear what you're saying, but what we know is that mortality in 2012 was 12,000 tonnes, and in 2023 it was 33,000 tonnes. Now, I understand there's been an increase in production, but that's more than double.
Can I intervene here? I understand how critical these numbers are. I think it's going to be difficult to get the figures right now because we know that it's sometimes reported in different ways, whether that's biomass, whether it's individual fish, whether it's percentages. So can I ask maybe that, given the questions that Edward Mountain's been asked, that we do have some clear indicators or comparisons from 2018 up to date for the committee to look over. I think that would be helpful.
Thank you. Convener, if I could push that just a wee bit more, because the evidence on the 2018 committee was based on evidence given from 2009 onwards, so it would be helpful to extend those figures, which I'm sure within the Minister's remit. So my final question is, based on everything that we've heard today, the 65 recommendations in the REC report, there are very few of them that have actually transpired into anything, and the industry's pushed on. Would you be surprised if we reran the committee report in 2000, or the committee recommendation 3 to the committee now, they might have taken a different view?
In relation to a moratorium, no, well, again, I think that as we've discussed at length today, I think first of all I would challenge that point about the overall progress on recommendations. I think I've outlined today there's been a significant amount of work that's been done across a number of different areas to address some of the recommendations. Some of that work is ongoing. But again, in relation to the committee recommendation 3 about a moratorium, I would hope that that would be something that the committee wouldn't agree to if it did come up again at committee today. I think we've outlined throughout the various sessions that the committee has had, I think just the complexities that exist around the issues of mortalities in particular. Not helped again, I think, by the data issues that we've talked about there, just how that data is recorded, how it's expressed, the reasons it's collected by different organisations. It is transparent, it is out there, but we have to recognise that what's important is what is causing that mortality and that we're taking the action to address it. And it's, if there was, to say, a moratorium on new businesses, I think we'd be penalising the industry. I think there are some issues that are beyond its control, and with all the other work that we're undertaking through the Sea Lice Risk Assessment Framework and the new framework that SEPA have introduced too, it's all about guiding that development to the right places. And I think that that has all been really positive and is achieving that. I mean, ultimately, all of the concerns and environmental concerns, if a fish farming business wants to get started, they have to go through this process. They have to show that there won't be that environmental impact. And I think all the work that's done on modelling and all the advances that have been there are really critical. And I do believe that we have the right regulations in place for the industry to deal with challenges where those exist. But I think it's also important to recognise the sheer volume of work that is going and the work that the industry themselves are doing, investing in all these key issues. issues to try and address them.
Can I just clarify, Convener, that recommendation 3 says expansion of existing sites, so it's not allowing them to get bigger. That's what the recommendation was. But what I take the point, Cabinet Secretary, that you've made about industry doing a huge amount of work and all the work that you're doing behind the scenes, but deaths have doubled as a percentage. That's a fact. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Minnitt. I suppose the last point is there were 65 recommendations in 2018 and concerns raised about the industry at that time, which led to a well-used phrase now, the status quo is not acceptable. Do you believe that sufficient progress has been made since 2018 to address the status quo from 2018, which was not acceptable?
I believe a lot of progress has been made, and as I hope I was able to outline in my previous response, I think when you look at some of the developments that have taken place into, I think, some of the points that were raised around sea lice through those recommendations, the introduction of the sea lice framework, the regulatory review that we've undertaken to try and really get to grips with those issues and drive forward work on that through the consenting task group. There's the work on science and innovation that we're taking forward too. Again, we've identified those areas where that work is still to be done, but we set out that we're still very keen to take that forward. But I do think that we are in a completely different place to where we were in terms of overall openness, transparency. That has very much improved over the course of that period of time since the report was first published. And I am pleased with the progress that we've made on recommendations, though, of course, I know, as I've already said, there are some areas where we still need to do further work.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, it's inevitable in such a long session that there's going to be a list of further information that you've committed to provide. Can I just say that the committee's timetable is looking like we want to deal with this and have reported by recess at Christmas. So could I ask that you could provide timely responses to some of the requests for further information?
Yes, I will. I think some of that information will be easier to provide than others, but we'll make sure that we get that to committee as soon as possible.
I appreciate that, and thank you for what has been a lengthy session. Your feedback and responses are hugely helpful. I now conclude this public section of the meeting and will now move into private session.